The first thing Abel needed to address was the stability of the horse carriage. To achieve this, he installed 4 sets of heavy-duty springs between the wheels and the carriage body, creating an advanced shock absorption system. Unlike anything available in this world, these springs were crafted with unparalleled quality, a result of Abel's past life knowledge and his immense physical strength. The process of making them was anything but simple. First, the spring iron had to be heated in a furnace until it was red hot. Then, it had to be hammered and shaped into thick iron rods before being carefully coiled around a metal shaft. Typically, specialized equipment would be needed for this, but Abel's raw strength eliminated the need for tools. Though these springs weren't as durable as 100 skills iron, they were still beyond the capabilities of ordinary blacksmiths. Had his body not undergone such rapid development in recent days, even Abel himself wouldn't have been able to forge them. Each group of 4 springs was securely fastened to a metal plate positioned between the wheels and the carriage's undercarriage. The entire process demanded both time and effort, but after much labor, 16 powerful springs were finally in place. With the suspension system completed, Abel turned to the most important enhancement, the magic-infused climate control system, crafting the magic-infused air conditioning system. Before beginning the enchantment process, Abel had already forged 20 thick rectangular sheets of 100 skills iron. Normally, such high-quality iron was reserved for legendary weapons like greatswords, treasured by blacksmiths and warriors alike. Yet, Abel had no hesitation in using them for an ordinary carriage modification, something only he could afford to do. Using his advanced forging skills, he heated each iron sheet in the furnace until it glowed a fiery red. Then, with a hammer drill, he meticulously carved a gemstone slot into each one. Once all 20 sheets were engraved, they were rapidly quenched in water to solidify their structure. After drying the metal, it was time for rune engraving. For this project, Abel chose to etch ice magic runes, something he had done countless times before. However, unlike previous attempts, this time he was working with intermediate ice magic rune ink, a highly fragile and intricate material. Mistakes could not be tolerated. Since this was meant for his own carriage, Abel ensured the utmost precision and safety. Though the rune ink was valuable, he had personally crafted it, keeping the cost relatively low. Thanks to his enhanced willpower, drawing the runes felt effortless. He engraved 5 ice magic runes before his energy ran low, prompting a 30-minute rest. Then, he resumed the process, completing 10 runes in total. Next, he switched to intermediate fire magic rune ink, using it to enchant the remaining 10 iron sheets with fire magic runes. Each iron sheet was then fitted with a corresponding gemstone, blue gems for ice magic and red gems for fire magic, all refined by Abel himself. With both rune types prepared, it was time for installation. Constructing the climate control mechanism, Abel crafted 2 large iron boxes, drilling multiple ventilation holes into them. These were then securely mounted on opposite sides of the carriage, forming the basis of the climate control system. Inside each box, he attached 10 fan arms, linking them to the carriage's wheels through conveyor belts. This way, whenever the wheels moved, the fans would rotate automatically. The ice magic sheets were installed inside one of the boxes, forming the cooling unit. A manual control handle was added, allowing different modes of activation. On the lowest setting, one ice sheet would activate, producing a gentle cooling effect. On the highest mode, all 10 ice sheets would engage, generating intense cold air. As the carriage moved, the spinning fans drew cool air from the enchanted sheets, dispersing it through the ventilation holes, effectively cooling the cabin. A similar system was implemented for the heating unit, utilizing the fire magic iron sheets in the second large box. With this dual-function setup, the carriage now featured a state-of-the-art magical air conditioning system, an unprecedented luxury. If auctioned, this system alone could fetch over 400,000 gold coins, surpassing the value of many legendary weapons. Final enhancements: durability and comfort. Beyond just performance, Abel made several structural upgrades to enhance comfort and durability. To further improve the ride, he wrapped each wheel in layers of high-quality orc skin. This premium material, previously stored away in Knight Marshall's secret collection, was too small to be used for armor. Instead of letting it gather dust, Abel repurposed it as reinforced tire padding, increasing shock absorption and ensuring better grip on rough terrain. With the structural modifications completed, Abel summoned skilled carpenters from a castle. He instructed them to enclose the air conditioning units in wooden casings, transforming them into elegant tables inside the carriage. Now, the cabin featured 2 comfortable sofas, 2 luxurious tables, housing the climate control system, a seamless cooling and heating system. After 3 days of tireless effort, Abel's masterpiece was complete. This wasn't just a horse carriage. It was a mobile palace, a technological marvel that could revolutionize transportation. As he stepped back and admired his work, Abel couldn't help but smile. The Lord of Marshall would undoubtedly be thrilled to receive such a magnificent birthday gift. The discovery of the Worgen runes. With the carriage finished, Abel turned his attention to 2 mysterious rune signs he had obtained from a Worgen. According to Knight Soroya, the leader of the brigade that had battled the orcs, the Worgen had activated a similar rune sign during combat, significantly reducing the impact of a combined attack from 33 knights. Abel pondered the nature of these runes. In Diablo II, there weren't many runes that specifically reduced impact, but based on his knowledge, these signs closely resembled the 12 #SOL Thor runes. 12 #SOL Thor rune effects. +9 lowest impact reduction. Offsets physical impact by 7. Abel suspected this rune had significantly weakened the combat chi strike of the knights. If his theory was correct, it could offset the strength of at least 30 fully trained knights, a formidable defense mechanism. Forging the ultimate knight's shield. Inspired by this realization, Abel decided to forge a shield using these runes. Although crafting legendary defensive weapons like the Ancient Vow was beyond his current abilities, he was confident that he could create a highly durable knight's shield. For the base material, he selected the finest iron ore, refining it from scratch. With his immense strength, he wielded a 100-pound hammer, striking the metal with overwhelming force. His previous 30-pound hammer now felt like a mere twig in his hands. Though the 100-pound hammer still felt somewhat light, it was the heaviest available. With each powerful strike, the iron was refined from 1 skill to 80 skills almost effortlessly. Normally, blacksmiths relied on willpower to enhance their craftsmanship, but Abel achieved the same result using brute strength alone. As he continued forging, he realized he had yet to reach his limit. Would this shield surpass 100 skills iron? And if he combined it with the SOL Thor rune, how powerful could it? Abel was a man of his word. With his power of will focused entirely on the iron base, he pushed beyond what was considered normal. Typically, a 100 skills iron base was the limit, but Abel had no intention of stopping there. Lifting his 100-pound hammer, he struck layer upon layer, repeatedly throwing the iron back into the furnace, reheating it to maintain its malleability. The rhythmic sound of hammering echoed through the forge, growing louder and more powerful with each strike. 101 skills, 102 skills, 103 skills. The count continued to rise as the iron base compressed beyond normal density. By the time he reached 120 skills, Abel felt something change. The metal structure had transformed. It was no longer the same material as before. Its stiffness and density had increased exponentially, making it impossible to strike using conventional forging techniques. This was something beyond the known 100 skills base, something entirely new. Realizing this, Abel decided to name it 120 skills base. Forging the knight's shield. Turning this refined base into a knight's shield was the next step. Unlike his usual work, he had to tap gently, shaping it with precision rather than force. When he reached the handle section, Abel cut a slot to embed a gemstone, a feature he incorporated into most of his weapons to enhance their magical properties. For rune selection, He chose intermediate attribute rune ink, which he had extensive experience working with. This time, however, instead of modifying the rune body, he added an energy rune circuit that connected directly to the handle. Unlike traditional runes, this method could only be applied once, making it a high-risk, high-reward enhancement. Once everything was in place, Abel embedded a diamond into the handle. This gemstone would serve as the energy source, channeling spiritual power to activate the rune. The moment the rune circuit successfully connected, a brilliant white light erupted from the shield's surface, signaling a perfect enchantment. Though untested, the process had gone flawlessly. Testing the shield's strength. Abel placed the shield on the ground and decided to test its durability. First, he struck it lightly, using just 1/10 of his strength, around 200 pounds of force. Upon impact, the shield flashed with white light, absorbing the blow completely. The energy dispersed without leaving a single dent. Encouraged by this result, Abel increased his power to 60%, equivalent to the combat chi strike of an intermediate knight. Once again, the shield flashed and effortlessly neutralized the attack. Excitement surged within him. He had created something beyond his expectations. Determined to push its limits, Abel unleashed his full strength, delivering a devastating 2,000-pound blow with his hammer. Boom! The sheer force sent a shock wave through the ground. The shield remained intact, but the impact drove it into the stone pavement beneath it, proving that while the energy absorption was incredible, it was not absolute. Abel had no idea what level of knight could strike with 2,000 pounds of force, but he was certain that no ordinary warrior could shatter this shield. Its resistance exceeded expectations, and even the surface remained flawless, free from scratches or dents. A weapon unlike any other. Magical weapons were revered for their ability to absorb and disperse damage, and Abel's shield demonstrated exactly that. As long as the diamond energy source remained charged, its defensive capability would persist indefinitely. Though it couldn't withstand magic attacks, Abel had yet to encounter any true magic users in battle. However, there was one problem. The shield, while functionally unmatched, was plain and unrefined. It lacked aesthetic appeal, missing the leather lining and intricate engravings common in knightly shields. Even so, Abel was proud of his creation, but a lingering doubt gnawed at his mind. According to Master Bentham, the maximum limit for refining iron was 100 skills, yet Abel had reached 120 skills. This contradicted everything he had learned. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to consult Master Bentham. Additionally, he needed the blacksmith master's expertise to identify the mysterious black armor he had acquired from Fowler. A visit to the blacksmith guild, Abel retrieved the black armor, mounted his horse, and rode toward the blacksmith guild. Upon arrival, Master Bentham greeted him with a curious glance, his gaze immediately drawn to the unusual shield in Abel's hands. "Is this your latest work?" Bentham asked, taking the shield and examining it closely. His fingers traced the surface, noticing an unfamiliar texture. His brow furrowed. "What kind of material is this?" he asked. "This isn't standard iron, is it?" Abel nodded. "I used the best iron ore from the mine." Bentham shook his head in disbelief. "Impossible. This material, it's not as strong as meteoric iron, but it far surpasses 100 skills iron. What forging method did you use?" The question was direct, almost intrusive, but Bentham's genuine curiosity and deep passion for blacksmithing made it clear that he couldn't help himself. Abel hesitated before responding. "I forged it from a 120 skills base." Silence. Bentham's entire worldview crumbled in that instant. "What did you just say?" he muttered, disbelief written all over his face. "I refined the base beyond 100 skills," Abel repeated. Bentham felt his understanding of blacksmithing shatter. But he didn't doubt Abel, not only because Abel had no reason to lie, but because the shield itself was proof. "Show me," Bentham finally said, eyes sharp with determination. Abel understood the unspoken challenge. "All right, I'll forge one in front of you," he said confidently. Demonstration in Bentham's workshop. Bentham wasted no time, leading Abel into his personal workshop. After rummaging through a pile of iron ore, he selected the best quality piece and placed it on the operating table. "This is the best iron ore I have," he said. "If you need better, I'll personally go to the mines and fetch it." Abel shook his head. "This will do." He grabbed the ore and threw it into the furnace, heating it to a molten red glow. Bentham watched in shock as Abel lifted a 100-pound hammer, something typically reserved for flattening tools, never for refining ore. "Wait, you're using a 100-pound hammer for extraction?" Refining a 100 skills iron base normally required thousands of strikes using a much lighter hammer. Bentham couldn't fathom how anyone could persist through such a grueling process. Yet Abel wielded the 100-pound hammer effortlessly, as if it were an extension of his arm. The workshop shook with every strike, the rhythmic pounding reverberating through the walls. From 1 skill to 80 skills. Bentham nodded. Abel was still following the method he had taught him. But then, Abel kept going. 81 skills, 90 skills, 100 skills. At this point, Abel's method diverged completely. He stopped using his power of will, relying instead on sheer brute force. Bentham's eyes widened in shock. He wasn't watching a blacksmith at work. He was watching a monster hammering the earth itself. As the 120th strike landed, the iron base was complete. Bentham stared at it in stunned silence. "How strong are you?" he finally asked. Abel hesitated. "About 2,000 pounds. Bentham nearly dropped the shield. 2,000 pounds? He repeated, horrified. Abel nodded. "That's without combat chi." Bentham froze.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Master Bentham turned the shield around. To his surprise, there was a gem installed. He could not help but ask, "Is this a magic defense guard?" "Yes, it's my new invention. It can absorb the impact of attacks," Abel explained. "Your abilities are miles ahead of me at this point." Master Bentham exclaimed. The master did not know how the impact could this shield absorb. If he knew, he couldn't be so relaxed like this. "I found some armor. Can you help me take a look at it?" "I am not sure what material is it made out of," said Abel as he placed the black armor onto the hands of Master Bentham. It was only at this moment Master Bentham realized Abel was carrying another thing with him. When the master received the armor, he almost dropped it. The weight of the thing was drastically lighter than its appearance. "Holy Wolf's treasure. How did you get this?" Master Bentham asked shockingly. "It's my spoil of war. A few days ago, I killed a war djinn and took it from him." "Is this thing called the Holy Wolf's treasure?" Abel was unsure why Master Bentham was so shocked, so he honestly replied, "This is a holy object of the war djinn. If they knew that you had this armor, they would do anything to get it back." Master Bentham then proceeded to say, "Remember how I told you about the legendary equipment? This armor is legendary." Master Bentham continued to explain, "According to the war djinn totem, a holy wolf had slaughtered the young of a black dragon. Although the dragons tried to hunt the holy wolf down, the holy wolf escaped eventually while being badly injured. He brought the core of the young dragon back to the Wurgens, and their blacksmith had turned it into armor. So, the war djinn you had killed must be a high-status royal war djinn." Abel was reminded of the war djinn long spear technique. He was certain what Master Bentham had said was correct. "The best thing you can do right now is to lock this armor up somewhere safe. Never let anyone know you have it," Master Bentham suggested. When Abel realized the danger of this armor, he decided to follow what Master Bentham had suggested. The Wurgens were one of the greatest nations of the Orc Empire. The idea of getting hunted down by them was not a pleasant one. Just thinking about it sent a shiver down Abel's spine. At first, Abel was thinking of wearing this armor if he decided to transform into a war djinn, so he could gain some protection. Luckily, he had asked Master Bentham before doing so. If he was going to wear this armor around the Orc Empire, it would be suicide. Had it novel been at. As he carried the Holy Wolf's treasure back to the castle, Abel didn't just hold it in his hand as he did before. He put it in a box and directly locked it up in his personal operation room as soon as he got back. He was the only person who had the key to this operation room, so it should be safe. As time passed, the atmosphere of Harry Castle was filled with more and more excitement. Since the Lord of Marshall's birthday was coming up and both he and his adopted son had just been promoted to lord, the Lord of Marshall decided to throw a huge banquet to celebrate all three of these good fortunes. He invited all the nobles of Harvest City, neighboring lords, and of course, the Knight of Bennett and his family. Other than going to the forest to comfort his lonely white cloud in his free time, Abel spent all his days in the blacksmith guide trying to forge weapons. He had prepared a lot of things to be auctioned at Edmund's boutique shop. Of course, they were not all magic weapons. If there were too many magic weapons in the market, it would definitely impact its value. Edmund's boutique shop was a boutique shop within the Duchy of Carmel. Since the duchy's spending was limited, Abel had prepared 10 120 skills big sword and 2 magic swords. These weapons were a lot better than any other ones on the market, so they should sell very well. On the 10th of June, the Harry Castle had transformed into a fiery red castle from a distance. All the walls were decorated with a huge red coat of arm rugs, which would only be brought out when there were some important events. All the roads connecting towards the castle had been cleaned. The servants had put on their new fitted suits, and even the guards were wearing their best armor. Just that Harry Castle was ready to welcome its guests. Although it was supposed to be a dinner banquet, the guests had already been arriving since noon. You could see countless busy servants roaming around the castle, since every guest was someone with high status. Since the Lord of Marshall's status had increased, his social group status had also increased. Although it was only a lord position, this position was very hard to achieve in Duchy of Carmel. Therefore, all the lords were very well respected. Especially since the Lord of Marshall was a lord with a fiefdom, he became one of the top members of the Harvest City's royal circle. Abel had already put on his luxurious suit before the banquet even started. Since he had never been to a king's wedding, he did not have a coat of arms in his chest pocket. Other than that, his suit was designed according to the status of a lord. This was because before this banquet, the Lord of Marshall had specifically invited the best tailor in Harvest City, Lady Candace, to make this suit for Abel. Abel was irritated by how complicated it was to put on this suit. In hot weather like this, clothes with so many layers like this suit had made him feel like he was being locked up in a box. However, according to the words of the Lord of Marshall, being a noble was not about how much money you had, but how much money you looked like you had. To Abel, this meant that you want to show off, you suffer. But of course, he would not say it out loud. You could see how much the Lord of Marshall cared about this banquet from all angles. The wine was all imported, which he had to order from the Harvest Cities many days prior. It was the Duchy of Thunder's 10-year edition wine. The silverware on the tables were all brand new, and even the chefs were specifically invited to Harvest City to cater to this banquet. Generally speaking, the Harry Castle did not have the rich historical significance of those 100 to 1,000-year-old castles. Although the Lord of Marshall was born in a large family, since he had gained his fiefdom and castle, by law he was no longer related to the Harry family in Bakong City. Also due to the long distance between their two cities, their relationship was not that close. Under these circumstances, the Knight of Marshall was very strict on the standard of this banquet. He was a man with dignity, and everything has to be perfect. Uncle Marshall, do you want me to send some servants here from Abel Castle? Asked Abel in a hurry. He realized that every guest in this banquet was someone with high status, so they demanded their own personal servants, which caused a shortage of servants in Harry Castle. That would be great, Abel, the Lord of Marshall replied promptly. He also realized the current situation. The servants who served in the castles were not just ordinary servants. Since they represent the face of their owner, they would need to go through specific training that was unique to the castle they serve. Abel had recruited the 2-horse carriage in the castle and headed towards Abel's castle. He needed to make sure there would be enough servants before the evening arrived. As the night came, Harry Castle was brightly lit. The Lord of Marshall stood in the middle of the castle hall, welcoming his guests. Abel stood beside with a smile, respectfully listening to the Lord of Marshall introduce his friends. "Welcome, Master Bentham. Welcome the Knight of Bennett," said Butler Lindsay. These words traveled through the entrance into the ears of Abel. Immediately, Abel rushed towards the entrance. He had to personally welcome his father, the Knight of Bennett. Abel also had a deep respect for Master Bentham. Although the master worked under the Harry Castle's blacksmith guild, he was Abel's teacher and a very famous person in Harvest City. "Father, Master, welcome to the banquet tonight." Abel had it all planned out. He ordered the luxurious horse carriage, which was supposed to be the Lord of Marshall's birthday present, to first pick up the Knight of Bennett's family, then Master Bentham. The Knight of Bennett got off the carriage first. When he saw Abel, his serious face leaked out a small, slight, gratified smile as he nodded to Abel. Then came his Nora. They had not seen each other for a very long time. When she finally saw Abel, her eyes began to sparkle. However, due to the seriousness of this event, she tried her best to hold her tears back. Next was his big brother Zach. When Zach saw Abel, he immediately jumped off the carriage and hugged him tightly. The Knight of Bennett gave a small cough, reminding Zach this was a serious event and that he should behave himself. Abel couldn't help but giggle. His big brother was still afraid of his father. He then proceeded to say with a smile, "My dear brother, when you become an official knight, I will make you a full body armor as a present." Zach's eyes began to sparkle. He let out a big laugh and said, "That day won't be too long. You better start preparing now." Master Bentham was the last person to get off the carriage. He smiled as he said to Abel, "This carriage was pretty nice. An old body like me didn't even feel a bump when sitting on it. But won't the Lord of Marshall be angry that you had picked me up with his birthday present? If the Lord of Marshall found out that I have a carriage and don't pick you up with it, he would be furious," Abel replied, as he reached out his hand to help Master Bentham off the carriage. Abel did not explain each of the features of this luxurious bull carriage in detail to Master Bentham. He did not want to spoil the surprise for the Lord of Marshall. Master Bentham also didn't know the value of this thing. Master Bentham only knew that Abel had added a shock absorber to the carriage, which he knew Abel could do so. After Abel had accompanied his father's family and Master Bentham into the hall, he decided to go back to the Lord of Marshall. Suddenly, he heard the voice of Butler Lindsay from the entrance again. The mighty Master Thorin Oakenshield had arrived. Although the Lord of Marshall had never met this master, he knew that Master Thorin was the judge of Abel's blacksmith master's examination. Therefore, he had sent him an invitation as well as a gesture of good manners. At first, the Lord of Marshall was not expecting Master Thorin to show up in these banquets, since he was a dwarf. Yet, he was here. This was probably because he wanted to show respect to Abel. "Welcome, Master Thorin," said Abel sincerely as he bowed to Master Thorin. "Hello, Master Abel. Although the human's lord status doesn't mean much to you, I and the Blacksmith Union still want to wish you well," said Master Thorin. His intention of coming to this banquet had become clear. He wanted to show everyone that the Blacksmith Union was on Abel's side. "Master Thorin, would you be able to stay at the castle for a while after the banquet? There are some things I want to ask you." Although Master Bentham had studied forgery under the dwarfs, he was never a blacksmith for the dwarfs. Abel had always wondered about this, so he wanted to ask Master Thorin. At first, Abel thought about visiting Master Thorin after everything was settled, but since Master Thorin was here, why not ask him today? "Of course, Master Abel, you must have some interesting ideas to discuss. I will stay." Master Thorin thought. Master Abel only asked him to stay because he had come up with some new inventions. Master Thorin was very happy to share his forging experience. Lord of Harvest, the Honorable Viscount Dickens had arrived. Fourth Prince of Duchy of Carmel, the Honorable Majesty Prince Wyatt George had arrived. Every guest was shocked by these words. Even the Lord of the City and one of the 4 princes of Duchy of Carmel were attending this banquet. The ruler of the city would rarely attend other people's banquet, let alone going to another person's castle to attend a banquet. Not only that, but someone with such an honorable status, such as the 4th Prince of Duchy of Carmel, had also decided to attend the banquet of an ordinary lord. How is that possible? As the host of the banquet, the Lord of Marshall and Abel quickly rushed towards the entrance. There were 2 horse carriages in front of the castle gate, which was followed by 8 knights. The owner of the carriage had already gotten off the carriage and heading straight towards the castle. The honorable city ruler, the Honorable Majesty Prince Wyatt's. "Welcome to Harry Castle," said the Lord of Marshall as he bowed to the two. "I heard it's your birthday, so I brought something for you as a gift," said Viscount Dickens with a warm expression as he took out a small box. The Lord of Marshall received the box. He said as he opened it, "I know you are very busy, so I didn't invite you. It was my mistake." Inside the box was a medal of honor. On its surface was etched with the drawing of the goddess of Harvest City. It was personally made by the priest of the goddess of Harvest City Shrine. It had been blessed to bring good fortune. The medal of honor was very complicated to make. Only one could be produced each year. Yet, countless lords in the city wanted one. It was said that the goddess of Harvest City would help protect the fiefdom of the owners of this medal. Although it was not hard for Viscount Dickens to obtain this medal, for him to give it away as a gift, it showed that he respected the Lord of Marshall a lot. "Thank you so much. This present was a treasure," said the Lord of Marshall with a face full of happiness as he put the medal back into the box. Had it novel been at. As Prince Wyatt saw that Viscount Dickens handing out a present to the Lord of Marshall, he expressed a bit of dissatisfaction. Although he had come to this banquet with Viscount Dickens, he was still a royal, and the royals in Duchy of Carmel always had tensions with the nobles. Although Prince Wyatt had a high status, his father King Astor George was not in good condition. If the king passed away, as the fourth prince, he would be kicked out of the royal family and became a noble. Since he did not have a fiefdom, he could no longer use the last name George. Moreover, if his offspring could not obtain enough outstanding military service, they would have become ordinary citizens. Therefore, other than the oldest prince, every other prince was trying their best to obtain an outstanding military service during their time as a prince. This was because no matter where they go, an elite guard would be by their side, which made getting an outstanding military service much easier. A few days ago, when Abel was auctioning his magic weapons at Edmund's boutique shop in Baycong City, Prince Wyatt was also traveling around the southern area. When the prince heard the news, he immediately came to join the auction. There were not many magic weapons in the human world. Therefore, Prince Wyatt wanted to buy some, no matter for personal use or bribing people. It would help him tremendously. There was only one reason why Prince Wyatt had traveled to Harvest City. He wanted to see Master Abel and directly buy some weapons off him. Luckily, he ran into Viscount Dickens on the way, so he decided to attend this banquet with him together. Since Prince Wyatt came in a rush, he did not prepare any gifts. Everything that he brought along with him was either too expensive or too cheap. There was nothing suitable as a gift. On top of that, this act by Viscount Dickens was trying to impact the prestige of the royals. Prince Wyatt was also not fond of the last name of Harry. In Duchy of Carmel, everyone knew that since the Harry family was one of the largest families in Baycong City, they opposed the royals. Prince Wyatt had just discovered that Master Abel was living in a Harry castle in Harvest City, and this Harry castle was exactly the offspring of the Harry in Baycong City. The night of Marshall, I came in a rush, so I didn't prepare any gifts. "I hope you can forgive me," said Prince Wyatt with a smile, followed by a bow. Abel watched from the side. He noticed the arrogance within the smile of Prince Wyatt. Moreover, he called the Lord of Marshall as the Knight of Marshall. Although his position had not been officially declared by the royals, according to the noble tradition, the name should still be changed with the title of a lord. "Your Majesty, your presence is the biggest gift to Harry Castle." The Lord of Marshall also disliked Prince Wyatt, but he still spoke with a face full of smiles. The two prestige guests had arrived at the hall. Suddenly the atmosphere began to light up. The highest status nobles began to approach and chat with Viscount Dickens and Prince Wyatt. While the nobles who were not prestige enough to chat with the two royals, they were also very excited for the fact that had a banquet alongside the ruler of the city and Prince Wyatt. This was something to brag about. "Master Abel, I came here today was all because I want to buy a magic weapon," said Prince Wyatt as he approached, Abel holding his wine glass. At the time, Abel was talking to Master Thorin about forging experiences, and the prince had interrupted their conversation. "All my magic weapons were sold through Edmund's boutique shop. If you want to buy one, feel free to join one of our auctions," said Abel with a slight sense of irritation as he thought about ignoring Prince Wyatt. He wasn't trying to gain anything out of the prince, and since the prince had disrespected the Lord of Marshall earlier, Abel was utterly in a bad mood. The dwarf's master Thorin curled his eyebrows. The request of the prince was unreasonable. Although blacksmiths would sell their weapons privately, they were often only reserved for their close friends. Blacksmiths needed to make a living too. The cost of producing these weapons often had an astronomical number, and buying them through an auction was the best way to support and motivate a blacksmith to raise their quality standard. I will give you 10,000 gold coins for one of your magic weapons. Prince Wyatt didn't seem to catch the rejection Abel had made, since he proceeded to speak with a sense of arrogance. Abel could not understand this prince. How could he show such bad manners in a banquet? Even Master Thorin, who did not say a thing, was shocked by the prince asking Abel to buy his weapons directly. "Did you know how much did my magic weapons sold for at Edmund's boutique shop?" Abel asked as he looked at the somewhat dumbly self-righteous prince. "Does it cost more 10,000 gold coins?" Prince Wyatt was unaware of the actual price of these weapons. However, he quickly realized that maybe he was underestimating the price. He proceeded to say in a strong voice, the auction price was inflated. "As the prince of the duchy, I will pay 10,000 gold coins for your magic weapon," which was more than enough. Prince Wyatt thought that, although Abel was a blacksmith master, he was still too young, and he had been scared for what he had said. Looking at Abel's silenced expression, the prince thought that Abel had accepted his offer. By that point, Thorin, the dwarf master, could not tolerate this anymore. A deep voice came from his long beard. "Are you threatening a blacksmith from the Union? Or do the Duchy of Carmel thinks that the masters of the Blacksmith Union are not worthy of being respected?" Only then did Prince Wyatt discover Thorin, the dwarf master. Since he was already very short, it was even harder to spot him at first glance when he was being covered by Abel. No, Master Thorin, that's not what I meant," Prince Wyatt promptly explained. Prince Wyatt didn't have a lot of money on him at the moment. Since the king's health was deteriorating, the prince's times as a royal was coming to an end. This was why recently he was spending a lot of time in the Duchy of Carmel, crazily trying to spend as many gold coins as possible, so his life would be easier in the future. To protect his valuables, he must recruit elites. With Abel's magic weapons being any knight's dream equipment, it would for sure to persuade any high-level knights to serve him. Wyatt's desperation made the situation seem like a death struggle before he lost his title as the prince. Not only so, but this process also seemed to make him lose his mind completely. Master Abel's work is worth 20,000 gold coins, but you want to force him to sell it to you by force for 10,000 gold coins. You then threaten him with your identity as the Duchy Prince. Do you know how angry the Union would be if I told them what you did? Thorin's voice became higher and higher, ultimately ending in a growling voice. It was no longer Abel's business, since he was a part of the Union. Something like what the prince had done would be in defiance of the Union as a whole, and they would not tolerate such behavior. The roar of Thorin, the dwarf master, startled all the nobles at the banquet. When they realized what Prince Wyatt had done, there were signs of anger revealing in their faces. Who was Abel? He was Harvest City's pride, youngest master blacksmith, as well as a successful lord that was looked up to by many. Viscount Dickens was also furious at the prince's action. It was him that had brought Prince Wyatt to attend this dinner party, but what Wyatt did made him lose his prestigious reputation, which was the most important thing to nobles. "Master Thorin, I didn't know the real price of the magic weapon. I was only skeptical about the price, and I didn't mean to offend Master Abel," Prince Wyatt said with a paled face as things got out of hand. If King Astor found out that Wyatt had offended the Blacksmith Union, the first thing he would have done was to kick his son out of the palace. This meant that he would not be given even the title of noble. He would have become an ordinary citizen, and no matter what, he would not accept this. "Master Abel, how do you want to go with this?" said Master Thorin. "The Blacksmith Union doesn't want to bring you any trouble. Since they were at Harry's castle, you want to know how Abel will approach this situation before they make a move. Master Thorin, today is Uncle Marshall's birthday, and since Prince Wyatt wants to purchase a weapon without knowing the actual value, I will take out a magic sword I had newly forged. I hope you can examine the price, so the prince can purchase it." The two new magic sword Abel had forged were both made with the 120 skills base, and the runes were written with intermediate rune ink, which had made magic power more stable. The dwarf master Thorin must know the actual value of this sword. Since Abel didn't want to deepen their tensions, he decided to just sell off one of these big swords to the prince. As you wish, Master Abel. Thorin, the dwarf master, thought that Abel did not want to cause any more trouble for the Union, so he tried to resolve the conflict. He could not help but admire. Abel then waved at his steward, Lindsay, to collect a magic sword from his operations room. After a while, Lindsay came out with a big sword. Master Thorin, this is my latest work. Please examine it and let me know your thoughts. Abel gestured to Lindsay to give the magic sword to Thorin, the dwarf master. The nobles on the side were all very curious to see this magic sword, a magic sword that worth 20,000 gold coins. It was even higher than the price of a castle, which made all the nobles watching the whole event extremely excited. Thorin, the dwarf master, took the magic sword and inspected closely at its body and flicked his finger on it. With the flick of his finger, a blue light flashed, and his fingers were immediately covered with frost. Thorin moved his fingers and quickly shook the frost off his fingers. He then turned and looked at Abel curiously. Your achievements was astounding. It was even more shocking considering your age. This sword was even better than the ones forged by the masters of my people. Although it was made with a normal iron, its quality had hugely surpassed 100 skills. The nobles all around listened quietly to Thorin's explanation of the weapon. This was an extremely rare opportunity to hear a dwarf master evaluating a weapon. Thorin, the dwarf master, bowed slightly towards Abel and said, Master Abel, I am glad you found a new method to produce stronger steel. I will forward a request to the Union to record this achievement in the Blacksmith Union Hall of Honor. The Hall of Honor was the blacksmith's holy temple in the Holy Continent, where records of all blacksmiths' achievements in improving their forging techniques have been passed down by countless people and recited by bards on the continent. I was already thinking of talking to you about this after dinner. Abel smiled back. At it novel Benedat. Thorin, the dwarf master, with a look of delight in his face, saluted. It was my pleasure to discuss with you. As Thorin picked up the magic sword again and said to the steward, Please bring me a piece of log. Shortly after, Lindsay sent for his servant to bring a 1-meter-long log to lay before Thorin, the dwarf master. Thorin, the dwarf master, took the magic sword and slashed directly onto the log with mild strength. The sword immediately sank a depth of 1 cm, and there was frost surrounding the log. Your use of the rune ink was rather unique, as the effects lasted much longer than any ordinary ink. In comparison to my kind of magic swords, yours was much more powerful, with formidable power. May I know your ink recipe? Abel had some difficulty in answering this question as he had combined the inks through the Horadric Cube. It did not have any formula or recipe. I'm sorry to make things difficult for you, Master Abel. I gotten too curious. Thorin, the dwarf master, touched his beard in embarrassment. Usually, it was an unreasonable request for another master for the recipe, but he couldn't help himself after he saw how powerful magic sword's effects were. Master Thorin instantly regretted these actions. Prince Wyatt's face was becoming gloomy, and the words of Thorin made him felt as if he was targeting him. Thorin continued to praise the magic weapon to raise the value of the weapon, which ultimately would cost him more gold coins. Viscount Dickens then interrupted the conversation with a smile and asked, How much is this great magical sword worth, Master Thorin? Thorin suddenly remembered that he had yet to assess the value of this magic sword. He quickly made some mental calculations and said, Thorin Oakenshield values this sword at 50,000 gold coins. When Thorin, the dwarf master, finished his evaluation, all of the royals at the castle all looked at the magic sword with a look of envy, jealousy, and longing in their eyes. Viscount Dickens picked up the magic sword with great curiosity. He then waved the sword for a few times and turned around to ask Abel, Master Abel, how many of these swords have you made this time? May I have one? Viscount Dickens, if you want it, I can give you the one I have. Before Abel could finish his sentence, Prince Wyatt's face immediately began blushing. Prince Wyatt did not have that many gold coins on him that evening. Though his identity was still a royal, he wasn't at the point where he could enjoy the magic gold card. If he had the inheritance of Duchy of Carmel, then he would have been eligible for it. As of right now, his identity as a prince, as well as the instability of his position, meant that he could become an ordinary noble anytime. I want to take away your personal one, Abel. If you don't have any magic sword right now, I can wait until your next forge. Viscount Dickens hated to be called Viscount. Everyone in Harvest City knew about this. Since Prince Wyatt's affected his name, it had made him very unhappy. However, he could sense that the prince might not have enough money. It didn't matter if he bought an extra weapon, as long as he could embarrass the prince right now. Viscount Dickens then took out his magic gold card from his pocket and said, "I can pay in advance, Master Abel. 2 of the same magic weapons have already been forged at this time, and since the ruler of the city needs it, you can have the other one." Abel turned to Lindsay and asked him to bring out the other magical weapon. Abel's workshop was not open to anyone. Only Lindsay and the Lord of Marshall were able to enter and leave the operations room. Now that Lindsay realized the values of the weapons, he decided to add a lookout post in the doors of the operations room. Lindsay moved swiftly within minutes. A large magic sword was soon in the hands of Viscount Dickens. Viscount Dickens waved the magic sword in his hand twice and happily held the magic gold card in front of Abel. Abel then also took out his magic gold card as he paired it with Dickens' card. Abel's balance then jumped immediately from 1750 to 51750. Abel was very short of gold until now. He had never held so much gold in his hand, but he was still too slow in earning these gold coins, considering the 270,000 gold coins were the amount he needed to pay for the potions required for his training. At that moment, everyone was staring at Prince Wyatt. The price of the magic weapon had been set by Master Thorin, and one had already been purchased by Viscount Dickens. Now it was up to the prince, who had no reactions, to make his next move. "Master Abel, may I discuss with you privately?" Prince Wyatt said to Abel in a dried-up tone. "Your Majesty, Prince Wyatt, this way, please," Abel said as he pointed towards the guest room. When Abel and Wyatt came back, there was a small smile on both their faces. Abel had a genuine smile, while the prince had a slightly bitter smile with his eyes sparkled darkly. Abel immediately raised his awareness as he came back from his discussion. By this time, Abel, who had superior mental strength, was aware of Prince Wyatt's malice. "This magic sword is yours now," as Abel handed the last of the magic sword to Prince Wyatt's hands. At it novel Benedette. This dramatic scene within the banquet of the Hairy Castle gave all of the nobles that were attending a tremendous surprise and shock. First, it was the fact that the ruler of Harvest City, as well as one of the 4 royal princes, was attending. Then they were shocked that one piece of Abel's forgery was able to reach up to 50,000 gold coins. When all the guests had left the castle with satisfaction, Thorin and Bentham were still talking with each other as they were staying over to exchange their forging knowledge. When the guests had all left, the Lord of Marshall immediately asked Abel impatiently, "What did the prince give you in exchange for the magic sword?" The prince exchanged a yard on the 1,000th level of Triumph Avenue in Bakong City for the magic sword, Abel replied. "The yard on Triumph Boulevard?" Lord of Marshall's eyes lit up and he laughed. "It's the best place in the entire duchy," he said. "I just wanted to settle it and get it over with. That's why I agreed." Abel was not afraid that Prince Wyatt would trade his cheap yard with him, since that would risk angering the blacksmith union. "Where's my birthday present?" The Lord of Marshall was very jealous of the new magic swords. From Master Thorin's introduction, it was certain that the newly forged magic sword was much more superior than the old magic sword. "Uncle Marshall, how can you not have a birthday present for your birthday? I have already prepared it for you. Let's go and have a look." Abel then led Lord of Marshall to the square, and when Master Bentham saw that Abel was going to show Lord of Marshall's birthday present, he took Master Thorin with him to look around. That's it. Lord of Marshall looked disappointingly at the carriage in front of him. The 2 fiery bulls were his and Abel's spoils of war. It was the best card in Harvest City, but it was far from what he had imagined. Abel made a lot of changes to the carriage. Master Bentham spoke from the side. "When he picked me up in this carriage, I noticed it was very stable." "Not bad." Lord of Marshall was a little relieved, and though his intermediate knight's body did not mind the stability of the cart, It was still better than a normal carriage, as Abel had taken a lot of effort to modify this carriage. Abel saw Lord of Marshall's face and knew that he was thinking of getting his magic weapon. Abel laughed and said, "Uncle Marshall, come inside the carriage and look." The four of them got into the carriage together. The spacious compartment was not crowded even with 4 people, and there was no problem at all if there were 2 more people. Lord of Marshall looked at the tables on either side and said, "That's a good idea. I can now put fruits on the 2 tables. How convenient." Abel gave Lord of Marshall a scornful look and said, "How could I possibly modify just a little, knowing your interests?" The Lord of Marshall looked indifferent. The greatest happiness in his life was meeting his wife. The greatest fulfillment was guarding the castle that he and his wife built together, and the greatest luck was to have Abel as his adopted son. His little hobby was to show off. With such a son to be fond of, how could he not show off? "This is the controller," Abel said, pointing to the switch near the table. "There are 10 switches. The table on the left regulates the cold air, and the table on the right regulates the heat." "Has it?" Lord of Marshall asked incredulously, touching the switch at the left table. Master Thorin and Master Bentham looked curiously at the 2 cupboards which could regulate the temperature of the carriage, and both were astonished at the apparition of a device that was said to have been used to control the temperature by magic. "The car needs to be moving before you can turn it on. Then you can press the controller to change the temperature," Abel explained. "Enough talking? Let's go for a ride." The Lord of Marshall called impatiently to the driver, sitting outside. As the 2 bulls took their steps and began to run, Lord of Marshall and Master Thorin both found that the carriage was much more stable than they had imagined. Since they had all finished the banquet, all 4 of them felt a bit hot. The Lord of Marshall pressed the start button and turned the air conditioner to the coldest mode, although they could not see how the machine operated. The fan was tied to the wheels of the carriage with a conveyor belt. With the movement of the carriage, the magic metal sheets began to spin, unleashing the ice magic power from the box to the rest of the carriage. "This is incredible." Master Thorin was the first to exclaim. "How did you do that?" Master Bentham asked. "It's a great treat." Lord of Marshall sighed. "It was easy." Abel opened the door under the wooden table on his left to reveal the iron cabinet inside. When the cabinet was opened, all 3 of them were shocked. Is this a magic sword?" The Lord of Marshall was certain that it wasn't a magic sword, but it was just with the appearance, other than that there were barely any differences. "Your way of thinking's left me speechless," aid Master Thorin, looking somewhat dumbly at the 10 iron plates in the cupboard. "It's a waste for the Lord of Marshall to ride in." Master Bentham said with a voice that was filled with envy. "And the one on the right?" the Lord of Marshall asked. "Yes, it was made with some fire magic gems," Abel explained while he opened the cupboard on the right. When the chests were opened on either side, Master Thorin was dumbstruck by Abel's style, while Master Bentham talked softly to the Lord of Marshall about borrowing the cart. Master Thorin was shocked by Abel's writing. He kneeled down to closely examine the magic metal sheets within the 2 boxes. After a while, he stood up and shook his head in awe. "Master Abel, your love for your stepfather was beyond my imagination. Every single one of these 20 magic metal sheets in here can be taken out and used as a magic weapon. Moreover, they hold the same value as the 2 magic weapons you sold today." After hearing Master Thorin's professional review, the Lord of Marshall's jaw can't help but drop to the ground. He then began to laugh loudly and asked, "Master Thorin, are you saying this horse carriage which Abel had given me cost more than 1,000,000 gold coins?" Master Bentham reached out his hand and patted the shoulder of the Lord of Marshall. He then spoke with a ridiculing tone. "Be careful, this thing is expensive. Someone might steal it." The Lord of Marshall arrogantly lifted his head, laughing loudly as he said, "No one would say this if they know the number of weapons I have equipped. So don't even think about taking me down if you are not a commander." Abel couldn't help but shake his head. His Uncle Marshall was in show-off mode again. Even in a banquet, the Lord of Marshall did not put down his 2 big swords. According to his own words, if a knight did have his weapons with him all the time, it would be suicide. Master Bentham and Master Thorin's eyes suddenly began to light up. The two big swords in the Lord's back was too flashy. All these times the two masters kept their manners and avoided asking the Lord about it. But since the topic has been brought up, the masters had become interested. The masters knew that Abel's best weapons were probably either reserved for his personal use or for his family. Therefore, the two big swords that the Lord of Martial had always carried around with him must have been Abel's finest of the finest. Let's have a look. What about these weapons that made you so crazy? Due to their many years of friendship, Master Bentham could just ask the Lord of Martial directly, without caring so much about being polite. Looking at how interested these masters were to his weapons, the Lord of Martial felt tremendously proud of himself. Although Master Bentham was not a real master, he was still one of the blacksmith elite of Harvest City. On the other hand, Master Thorin was a part of the Blacksmith Union. He was an acclaimed master of the entire Holy Continent. The Lord of Martial disarmed the two big swords from his back and placed one of them on the table of the carriage. In regards to the other one, he was not willing to let go of his hand. He turned to Abel and said with dissatisfaction, "This ice magic sword isn't even as good as the sheets of metal in the carriage. How can I show it to people?" The masters looked at each other and smiled. Abel said with a choice, "Fine, I'll make a new one for you the next few days. Just put up with this one for now." The masters then looked at the magic sword on the table. They mutually told each other that they could have a look first. At last, it was Master Thorin who took out the sword out of the sheath. Master Thorin lightly flicked the blade of the sword with his finger. The strange thing was that this big sword doesn't seem to be too different from those ordinary ones. It doesn't seem to have any special effects, and since the gem in the handle was covered with decorations, Master Thorin felt a bit confused. He turned and asked Abel, "Is this a magic sword?" Of course, this sword would only unleash its power when attacking. Lightly flicking on the blade doesn't count as attacks. Abel honestly explained, "What magical attribute is this sword?" Master Thorin proceeded to ask, "None. It only has the ability to rumble off enemies," said Abel. "No way. That's impossible." Master Thorin was a bit lost for words. He then picked up the sword and said to the Lord of Martial, "The Lord of Martial, can you please step off the carriage with me and test out the ability of this sword?" "Of course, Master Thorin," said the Lord of Martial as he opened the carriage door and jumped off. After everyone had got off the carriage, Master Thorin lifted the magic sword and struck towards the sword of the Lord of Martial, who was already in defense position. When the swords came to contact, a white light flashed from the magic sword in Master Thorin's hand. Afterward, the Lord of Martial could not help but get knocked back for 10 steps. Master Thorin still could not believe what he saw. He exchanged sword with the Lord of Martial, but the result was the same. Master Thorin, who was now holding the magic sword, had been knocked back for 10 steps. "My God, this is a golden weapon." "Master Abel, you could produce a golden weapon. Do you know what does this signify?" There were only 2 blacksmiths in the entire nation of dwarfs who could produce a weapon of this level. Master Thorin proceeded to spoke with excitement. "You had become the greatest blacksmith of the Holy Continent, or in other words, a perfect master." Abel didn't seem to be too excited by these words from Master Thorin. This was because his goal was no longer to increase his rank as a blacksmith. All he wanted now was to become a wizard. Everything else was pale in comparison. Master Bentham was there to witness each step of Abel's transformation from an amateur to the master he was today. Now, Abel's level had increased once again. He could not help but exclaim, "Abel, your growth has been tremendous. Now, I can only look at you from afar, hoping you can make good use of your gift as a blacksmith." "How much money do these magic weapons?" asked the Lord of Martial curiously. Interruption the masters. "Had it novel been at?" After Master Thorin heard that the Lord of Martial was trying to put a price on a golden weapon, he couldn't help but felt a bit angry. However, since he was the stepfather of Abel and the owner of this golden weapon, the master has no choice but to shook his head and said it was very hard to calculate the cost of these golden weapons. There were very little records of them being auctioned in history, as most of them were sold privately. However, if I really have to put a price on it, I'll say above 200,000 gold coins. These words made the Lord of Martial's knees felt weak. His spirit was impacted once again. Since when does the price of the things in his castle gain so many zeros. He thought about the castle's income, and his life saving. It doesn't even come close to the price of this sword. However, after he thought about it for a bit, he realized he was actually the owner of this sword, and Abel was his successor. The Lord of Martial's mood was lifted again. He stood up straight, strongly affirming himself. At first, Abel thought about showing Master Thorin the magic big shield he had just made. However, this magic sword he had made long ago had already brought such a shock to Master Thorin. If he kept bringing out more and more magic weapons, it would make him come across as a bit of a show-off. On top of that, Abel also realized he had underestimated the value of these magic weapons, so he decided not to show Master Thorin any more of it. After they returned to the castle, Abel was reminded of the evil intent of Prince Wyatt, so he brought the Lord of Martial to his private operating room within the castle. "Abel, what's happening?" The Lord of Martial asked in confusion. "Uncle Martial, I have a feeling that the situation with Prince Wyatt will not be settled that easily. You have to be careful when you go out," said Abel quietly, expressing his worries. "No worries. The big sword in my hand will not be afraid of him," said the Lord of Martial carelessly. He was a survivor of the orc attacks, not just an ordinary knight. His glory was built on the corpses of orcs. Seeing the arrogant look of the Lord of Martial's face, Abel had gotten ever more worried. Therefore, he had taken out the magic big shield he just made and handed it to the Lord of Martial. He said, "Here, take this shield. Don't let go of it the next few days." The Lord received the shield with a face full of excitement. Everything his adopted son made was a treasure. Since everything he owned would be under Abel's name in the future, he had never rejected any of Abel's gift. "What rank is this shield?" asked the Lord of Martial. "According to the words of Master Thorin, this should be a golden level shield," said Abel after he thought for a bit. "What's its ability?" The Lord of Martial proceeded to ask with care. "It can at least absorb the combat chi attack of an elite knight," Abel replied. "Then what am I afraid of? Prince Wyatt can come right at me. I have 200,000 gold coins weapons, a 1 million gold coins horse carriage. That kid doesn't even have enough money to buy a 50,000 gold coin weapon. How can he ever compete with me?" At that moment, the Lord of Martial seemed to forget how much money he had in his wallet. All these outrageously luxurious equipment had made his self-esteem even higher than Mount Budapest. Within a luxury room of Cosmo Hotel, the largest hotel in Harvest City, Prince Wyatt was sitting on a chair with a face full of gloom. The coffee on his table had gone cold long ago. "Your Majesty, don't be so angry. It's not good for your health," said the elite knight guard of Alsop. He was trying his best to carefully comfort Prince Wyatt. In regards to a banquet, the prince and the 3 elite knights had attended yesterday. Because they were not a noble, they had dinner with the retinues. A group of bogans could make fun of the offspring of King George. They must have forgotten who was the true ruler of this country. Prince Wyatt had been holding his anger back since the banquet, so he began to lash out through the comfort of the Knight of Alsop. When he thought about the ridicule looks of the Harvest City's noble, Viscount Dickens' offense, and the lack of respect Abel had shown him, Prince Wyatt, who was spoiled by thousands, was furious. If he tries his best, he could tolerate the ridicule of nobles and offense of Viscount Dickens. However, he could never tolerate a 13-year-old teenager unwilling to respect his status. Alsop, what would happen if I kill Abel? Prince Wyatt trusted the Knight of Alsop a lot, so he had directly told him his intention. This idea had deeply shocked the Knight of Alsop. He quickly replied, "Your Majesty, we must not try to mess with Abel. Otherwise, we would become enemies with the entire blacksmith union. If I have to seek this revenge, I will never be satisfied," said Prince Wyatt as he ruthlessly stared at the Knight of Alsop. He then proceeded to say, "If I can't kill Abel, how about the Lord of Martial? Your Majesty, the blacksmith union probably won't give us any trouble for killing an ordinary lord. Moreover, we could just blame it as a robbery attack." The Knight of Alsop replied softly, "Nice, I'll leave it to you," Prince Wyatt said ruthlessly. The Knight of Alsop looked at Prince Wyatt with a hint of embarrassment. Although he was an elite knight, he was not confident in murdering an intermediate knight by himself. Murdering someone was different from defeating someone in a battle. If the Lord of Martial had escaped, they could have big trouble. The Knight of Alsop was the only guard out of the four who had a close relationship with the prince. The other three elite knights belonged to the Royal Defense Force. They were only responsible for the safety of the prince, and they would never needlessly attack a noble based solely on the prince's interest. At novel Benedet. Seeing the embarrassed look of the Knight of Alsop, Prince Wyatt couldn't help but sigh. He then proceeded to say, "Take these 10,000 gold coins and see which one of the three are willing to come with you. Also, take this magic sword with you. I want Abel's stepfather to die in the strikes of his own sword." "That will be perfect. 10,000 gold coins would be more than enough to persuade those greedy bastards," the Knight of Alsop said with ease. The banquet in Harry Castle had ended, yet the Lord of Marshall could not settle. He had to go visit a friend in Harvest City and exchange some knight fighting techniques with him. Almost everyone in the castle knew the reason behind the Lord's visit. Right in the morning, the Lord of Marshall got on his bull carriage and headed towards Harvest City. He enjoyed riding on his carriage lately, not only because the two Inferno bulls were very eye-catching, but most of all, this carriage was some of the most comfortable things he had ever sat on. The sun was blazing outside, so the Lord of Marshall turned the air conditioner to level 6. He closed his eyes, enjoying this rare cool breeze under the summer heat. If he had a bottle of wine with him, it would be perfect. The first thing he wanted to do when he returned to his castle was to tell someone to add a liquor cabinet in this carriage. "Master, someone is blocking the way," said the driver with a shaky voice as the bull carriage came to a halt. As the Lord of Marshall was enjoying himself, suddenly his heart dropped. He was reminded of the warning which Abel had given him. He began to pick up his big sword with the rumble ability, while clenched his shield with the other hand. He peeked outside the carriage. At first, the Knight of Alsop thought about attacking the Lord of Marshall when he was unaware, but the other elite knight that came along with him refused. As the Knight of the Royal Defense Force, they had to respect the knight's virtues. They could not attack an opponent who was not prepared. Therefore, the Knight of Alsop had no choice. He had to block the carriage and directly attack the Lord of Marshall. "Are you guys Prince Wyatt's elite knights?" The Lord of Marshall recognized they were two of the 4 knights guarding Prince Wyatt during the banquet. "I am here to take your life, but will give you a chance to battle," said he. Knight of Alsop. He one-handedly lifted his big sword and drew a straight line in midair. Then he put his sword back to his side and made a knight gesture of manner. "Fair enough. You followed the knight's virtues." The Lord of Marshall looked at the 2 elite knights on the horse with a sneer. The Knight of Alsop knew that the Lord of Marshall was an intermediate knight. Defeating him was easy. The hard part was to not let him escape, so the elite knights did not disarm their horse. Although the carriage driver was paranoid, he remained silent. He knew that he would only have the chance to keep his life if the Lord of Marshall won this battle. If not, the 2 elite knights would not give a peasant like him a chance to go back and report them. The Knight of Alsop squeezed the horse with his leg. The horse let out a long neigh and began to rush forward with its muscly legs. With the speed of the horse and the roar of the Knight of Alsop, his body and his big sword were covered in combat chi. He began to strike around 5 meters in front of the Lord of Marshall. Under the combination of all these forces, the knight seemed unstoppable. "Defense!" the Lord of Marshall roared. He placed his faith in Abel and his magic shield. Moreover, he was also all too familiar with this knight defense move. He had executed it perfectly in battles countless times and counteracted countless enemies. The Lord of Marshall held the shield with his left hand and placed the magic shield in front of him. His body leaned forward, front leg bent, and back leg straight. The Lord was ready to take on the Knight of Alsop's attack. Dong! The sword of the Knight of Alsop struck upon the shield of the Lord of Marshall. At first, he was expecting his sword to penetrate the shield, then he could finish off the Lord of Marshall with thunderstorm combination strikes. The Lord of Marshall was fully aware of how powerful the charging attack of an elite knight could be, so he almost used full force in this defense. However, little did he know, when he was holding this magic shield, he almost did not feel a thing at all. The strike had been counteracted. The Knight of Alsop was shocked as he went straight past the Lord of Marshall. The Lord of Marshall did not even budge a bit. How was this possible? The magic sword in his hand was exchanged with a yard in Triumph Boulevard, valued at 50,000, and it could not even defeat an intermediate knight. The Knight of Alsop began to wonder if he had been scammed. The Knight of Alsop looked a bit distracted, yet the Lord of Martial remained in full focus. All these years of battle experience had taught him that he has to constantly look for the chance to execute the final strike. So if he was not focused all the time, it would be suicide. In that split second, the Lord of Martial began to flash his combat chi and rush straight towards the Knight of Alsop. Although his horse was not as fast as his impose was just as strong. The Knight of Alsop only realized what was happening through the call of the other elite knight, who was watching by the side. At that moment, the Lord of Martial was already right before him. So the Knight of Alsop quickly dashed out a counteract move with his sword. To his surprise, this strike by the Lord of Martial was extremely light, like the strike of a normal civilian. But after a while, he felt the force of a mountain pressing upon him, alongside his horse. He could not help but began to step back. Under the influence of the magic sword's rumble, the Knight of Alsop's defense was defenseless. He was completely exposed. This was all in the plan of the Lord of Martial. The reason he did not use any force in his strike was that all his force was concentrated on his leg. As the Knight of Alsop was stepping back, he immediately jumped towards the Knight of Alsop holding a shield. Like a struck of lightning, his big sword let out a cold flash of light and penetrated the gap between the armor and the waist of the Knight of Alsop. Normally, this gap was very hard to penetrate if it was not being exposed, so the Lord of Martial had taken advantage of it. That strike was very powerful, since intermediate knights could inject their combat chi into their weapons. A large amount of destructive combat chi rushed inside the body of the Knight of Alsop. In a blink of an eye, he lost all of his fighting power and fell from his warhorse. Attack! The other elite knight roared. A long white string of combat AI shot out from his big sword. Although these long-distance attacks were exclusively used by elite knights, they would rarely use it because it used up too much of their combat chi, which was not sustainable. Defense! The Lord of Martial also roared. The shot of combat chi struck upon the shield, but the result was the same. The Lord of Martial did not even budge behind the shield. By that point, the Lord of Martial had become very confident. With equipment over the value of 400,000, even an intermediate knight, like himself, could easily counteract the attacks of an elite knight. When the other elite knights saw that the Lord of Martial had easily defeated the Knight of Alsop, he decided to change his strategy and do long-distance attacks instead, since he was the same rank as the Knight of Alsop. Before he could fully understand why the Lord of Martial had defeated the Knight of Alsop so easily, he would keep his distance. However, an elite knight could not keep using these long distance for long. He began to have a change of heart. He rather just returned the 10,000 gold coins to the prince because it was not worth it to risk his life. The other elite knight continued to shoot out his powerful combat chi, sparkling in midair. Yet, the Lord of Martial could counteract it perfectly every time from different positions. The Lord of Martial was waiting for the other elite knight to fatigue. He thought, other than a head commander, these elite knights could not sustain these long-distance attacks for long. Suddenly, with the shot of another combat chi, the elite knight began to turn around. In a blink of an eye, he had accelerated on his horse and began to escape. The Lord of Martial felt a bit confused. This was an elite knight. Why was he trying to escape? The Lord of Martial did not chase after him immediately. His legs could not outrun the legs of a warhorse. Although he could use the Knight of Alsop's warhorse, it would take some time before they could be harmonized. The Lord of Martial returned to his horse carriage, put down the shield in his trunk, and took out the hairy bow. By the time point he had set up the bow, the elite knight was around 100 meters away. He lightly let loose the bowstring. In a split second, the arrow had disappeared from the bow and soon reappeared in the back of the elite knight. Adet Novel Benedet. Elite knights were not only powerful due to their ability to use combat chi, but it was also because they had very sharp alertness to danger. Although it was almost impossible for a normal person to avoid this arrow, in a blink of an eye, the elite knight lightly twisted his body. The arrow traveled through his right arm and struck right in the center of his warhorse's skull. The warhorse skidded and fell to the ground, sending the elite knight flying forward. The moment when the knight was about to hit the ground, he did a body roll and stood up straight away. He did not stop as he continued to unleash his combat chi, madly running towards the forest nearby. Only a dead warhorse and the blood of his right arm was left on the ground. All of these things had taken place in almost no time. Before the Lord of Martial could install another arrow, the elite knight had already disappeared. The hairy bow was too weak. The Lord of Martial concluded. He failed this time was because the bow only had 400 pounds worth of strength. If it had 500 pounds, no way this knight could escape. The Lord of Martial must have forgotten. The strongest bow in this world could only possess about 200 pounds worth of strength. Only this composite bow that Abel had modified could have such power. The Lord of Martial knew he could not chase after this knight anymore. However, he had already badly injured an elite knight and scared off another. The knights even left their mounts behind, so the Lord of Martial was very pleased with how this battle had turned out. He then walked towards the body of the knight of Alsop. At the time, the knight had already stopped breathing. The first thing the Lord noticed was his magic sword. Isn't this the sword Abel had forged? The Lord of Martial was surprised to find this sword, and he was happy to take it as his spoils of war. This way was a lot better than asking Abel directly. His two ways of acquiring these magic weapons would make a night and day difference when he would brag about it to his friends. The Lord of Martial had secured the knight of Alsop's warhorse behind the back of his carriage and threw the dead body of the knight of Alsop on top of it. He no longer felt like going to his friends as he headed straight towards the city palace. The Country Defense Force elite knight returned to the Cosmo Hotel covered in blood. With the help of the other guards, he entered the room of Prince Wyatt. Upon seeing that only one of the two elite knights he sent had returned, not only that but covered in blood, Prince Wyatt can't help but get angry. He roared, "The Knight of Kyle, where's Alsop? Why only you had returned? Your Majesty, the accident had failed. The Knight of Alsop was badly injured. I'm not sure if he's dead or alive. I've only got lucky and escaped." The Knight of Kyle's face was drenched in sweat. He continued to use his combat chi to escape after being injured. His current condition was not looking too well. If he doesn't recover probably, he might not be able to preserve his elite knight's power. As the guard of the prince, it was his responsibility to report what had happened. Therefore, no matter what, he had to hold back his pain and rush back here. Rubbish. Two elite knights can't even defeat an intermediate knight. Why didn't you die in the battlefield instead? Prince Wyatt roared furiously as he threw his wine glass at the Knight of Kyle. The other knights saw that the Knight of Kyle was about to faint, so they quickly stepped up and held him by the arm. The knights made eye contact with each other. Their gaze showed a sense of anger, sorrow, and dissatisfaction for the prince. There was a price to a knight's loyalty. No matter what, they have to be loyal to the person they were loyal to. The prince didn't even seem to even care if the Knight of Alsop was dead or alive. All he cared about was if they had completed the mission for him. The knights all felt a sense of disappointment and sorrow. "How many opponents did you had?" asked Prince Wyatt, ignoring the poor condition which the Knight of Kyle was in. "Only the Lord of Martial." The Knight of Kyle said with a lot of effort. "How can Martial be that powerful? He was only an intermediate knight, and he could defeat elite knights," said Prince Wyatt suspiciously. Suddenly, he remembered something. He ruthlessly stared at the Knight of Kyle. "Where is the magic sword that the Knight of Alsop had brought along with him?" "Your Majesty, I have no choice but to escape. I did not have time to retrieve the magic weapon," said the Knight of Kyle. His face had become paler. "That thing worth 50,000 gold coins, and you didn't retrieve it?" said Prince Wyatt. His suspicions continued to increase. Suddenly, an idea flashed in his mind. But as he looks at the wound on the Knight of Kyle, he couldn't help but groan. Suddenly, the prince had another idea. He began to mutter, "If the Lord of Martial could defeat 3 elite knights, will he come after me? Damn, I should have brought more guards along with me." At this moment, the prince no longer cared if the Lord of Martial was dead or alive. He was only an ordinary lord after all. The only thing that was worrying about was if the Lord of Martial would urge to come to Harvest City and find him. The guards next to him could be no match with the Lord. "Prepare the horse. We have to leave now," Prince Wyatt shouted at the healthy guards. "With the current condition of the Knight of Kyle, he cannot ride a horse," said an elite knight, pointing at the Knight of Kyle. "We'll leave him here. Just give some money to the servants and tell him to take care of him. Now, let's hurry and get out of here," said Prince Wyatt. He looked at the blood-drenched Knight of Kyle, and it sent shivers down his spine. He thought, if the Lord of Marshall decided to seek, he might end up like the Knight of Kyle. This action by the prince had made the elite knights utterly disappointed. They decided that the first thing they would do when they got back was to resign from the country's defense force. A majesty like this doesn't deserve to be served by them. Not long after Prince Wyatt had left, Viscount Dickens led a few men into Cosmo Hotel. They realized that the prince had already escaped. They captured the Knight of Kyle, who has been left behind. Prince Wyatt's attempt to assassinate Marshall did not go as smoothly as he had expected. He was the son of King Astor in the Duchy of Carmel. This meant that his attempt would significantly deepen the already tense relationship between the royals and the nobles. As a knight who has been awarded the title of Lord through attaining outstanding military service, and with Abel as his adopted son, who is also a newly promoted lord and a blacksmith master, Harry Castle within Harvest City could be found in the discussion among every noble in Duchy of Carmel. This family, with a unicorn as their coat of armor, had produced 2 lords, and both of them gained their fiefdom through outstanding military service. The Lord of Marshall had suddenly become the idol of many nobles and knights. There was only one opportunity every 4 or 5 years to become an owner of a knight estate. That's why it was every knight's dream to achieve this title. When the Lord of Marshall was young, he fought bravely against the orcs and was granted fiefdom, and ultimately, he was awarded the title of knight due to his heroic deeds, as well as demonstrating the valor in the code of chivalry. His love for his wife, infatuation for life and death, and his effort in guarding the castle where his wife was buried in, all showed how Marshall had truly kept the knight's declaration of, "I swear to love and death." He alone had defeated 20 orcs, the majority of them, and protected the castle against attackers. At Novel Benedet, he rescued Matthew's castle with the identity of an intermediate knight alongside Abel. Together, they repelled against the attacking enemies. Everything the Lord of Marshall had done was noticed by the world due to his title as a knight. As time passed, more and more people began to notice him. It was at this time that Viscount Dickens had submitted the attempt assassination of Marshall towards the arbitration tribunal for nobles. The 2 elite knights, one dead and one alive, who were responsible for the assassins were both captured and brought to court. When the news had spread, there was an uproar amongst the nobles. They were called the nobles due to their prestige identity, and they were honored and respected by many. In the noble circle, any hatred for between any nobles would be solved by a formal duel. The duel would invite the noble to arbitrate. A private attack on the nobles would generally be a felony. However, if it was an ordinary person, showing any signs of hostility would have already been a serious crime. If a nobleman was defeated on the battlefield and demanded the treatment of a nobleman as a prisoner of war, no one would have dared violate the rule of knights. All these rules and laws were designed to keep the nobility safe. But now, a royal member had attempted to kill a lord who had just been honored for his merit. This made the nobles even angrier than before. After the noble court of honor had collected all of the pieces of evidence, they informed every noble family in the city. The 4 big noble families of Bakong City, led by the Lord of Marshall's relatives, the Harry family, fired a report to King Astorgorge, demanding Prince Wyatt should be punished harshly. At that moment, Abel was sitting on White Cloud. When he heard that Marshall was being attacked, he immediately went into the operations room and forged 4 exploding big swords. He even placed the scroll of town portal, which had never left him, into a metal box. As Abel filled the Horadric cubes with 4 exploding big swords, he took a spear from the weapons rack and called out White Cloud from the forest behind the castle. "White Cloud, let's go faster today," Abel said softly as he gently patted White Cloud on the neck. White Cloud gave a little tweet, indicated that it understood what Abel said, and promptly flapped its wings. Knowing Abel's hurriedness, It quickly flew as fast as it could, and its huge body passed through the clouds and broke it apart. Abel assumed that Prince Wyatt and his guards must have been rushing back towards Bakong City as soon as possible. When the direction was confirmed, Abel carefully examined the ground and quickly regretted not completing his telescope. If he had a telescope, it would have been much more convenient. "Let's take a break, Your Majesty. The horses are tired," one of the night guards said to Prince Wyatt as he felt sorry for the horses. "It's a long way from Harvest City. I don't think Marshall will be able to chase us here. Let's have a rest here for a bit," Prince Wyatt said as he nodded at the horses, who were all sweating and snorting. Since the three left in a hurry, they needed to travel lightly and left their carriages and servants behind. It seemed to be that they would be returning to Bakong City with only themselves. A night guard lit a bonfire, while the other went hunting, who was overqualified to do so as an elite knight. Within a short moment, he had already caught 2 rabbits and a wild chicken. Soon, it was on the fire, ready to be served as food. "When I get back to Bakong City, I'll get my men together and walk all over Harry Castle," Prince Wyatt ranted as he ate the tasteless food. The elite knights were silent, quietly eating their food while ignoring the prince's words. Prince Wyatt noticed the silent protest from these knights. He became very dissatisfied with their attitude, since he believed that they were supposed to protect him with their lives. Although Prince Wyatt was born a royal, he was only the 4th prince. There were 3 brothers that were above him and below him, successful in their own rights. Hence, in the kingdom, Wyatt was not the king's favorite child. Alongside his mother's early death, it meant that he was raised by a steward. This led to his wild and arrogant behavior. Apparently, education within the royal family couldn't seem to change this habit. When things were going well, Wyatt tended to be polite. However, when he felt hurt, he sought reckless acts of revenge. By this time, Wyatt was convinced that it was Abel's fault. It was Abel who had caused these chains of events that made his life miserable. Hence, Abel had to pay the price. The royal warhorses were the best of the best from the Duchy of Carmel, but within half a day's pursuit, White Cloud took around an hour to catch up. Looking down from the sky, Abel recognized Prince Wyatt and his 2 elite knights. Wyatt's distinctive royal dress, as well as the golden armor of the knights, made it easy to spot. Abel then took the necklace out of his coat, placed it on his hands, and began chanting the ancient orc spell. With a flash of green light, Abel had soon turned into a wargen. In his heart, he commanded White Cloud to dive down. The mark of the Horadric square on his hands began to flash as White Cloud's body drew a beautiful curve and came swooping down. "Look out! Something's up there," said an elite knight. Their sense of awareness was very sharp. Reacting to attacks was an instinct for them. The knights immediately flashed their combat chi and shook their bodies while they moved in front of Prince Wyatt to protect him. "It's a sky sparrow. It's an orc attack," said the knight. He looked up at the sky. There was a huge sky sparrow came swooping down. When White Cloud was around 20 meters above the ground, it began to fly back up. Abel quickly took the 4 exploding swords from his Horadric Cube, which were resting at the time. Within half a second, he took them out and threw it down with all his might at the 3 men on the ground. Watch out for dark weapons. Defensive position. With Prince Wyatt behind them, the elite knights could not give in. They had to use their swords, which were filled with combat chi, to defend. Although their swords were not very wide, the well-trained elite knights didn't think that 4 dark weapons from the sky were able to break their defenses. 1, 2, 3. Abel counted in his mind as 4 bangs followed, sending dust and gravel flying around with the blast. Abel sat on White Clouds and looked down after the dust and the wind driven away. The 2 elite knights wearing golden armor were covered with scars, fresh blood gushing out from their wounds. 2 elite knights were badly injured in at least 10 places, but they had a very strong vitality, which allowed them to stand still and maintain a defensive posture. "Go down," Abel said to White Cloud. About 10 meters above the ground, Abel jumped off from White Cloud and went towards Prince Wyatt with a long rifle. The damage to Prince Wyatt's body was very minor. The main damage was blocked by the 2 elite knights in front of him. Although there was a wound on the Price left leg, which was bleeding, he still could not fully comprehend. Wargen, one of the elite knights, shouted when he saw Abel's transformation. During this shout, fresh blood spilled quickly from his wound, but he didn't seem to care. Instead, he turned to another knight and shouted again, "Take the prince and leave." This elite knight then immediately rushed towards Abel with a flash of combat chi. He knew that if he didn't strike now, he wouldn't be able to fight back as his injuries worsened. This was Abel's first encounter with an elite knight. Although the Wolf Rider long spear technique of the Wolf Royal family can achieve maximum power without a Mount Wolf, it could still double the strength. Suddenly, there was a strange orc howl coming from Abel's mouth, and by howling, the spell of the Wolf Rider was added to his long spear. With technique number 11, Abel charged forward with the thrust of his spear. Within seconds, he was up close with the advancing knight. Abel didn't know the strength of an elite knight, but according to the Lord of Martial's intermediate knight interpretations, the elite knight's strength would not exceed 1,000 pounds, and the combat chi would at most increase it to 2,000 pounds. This meant that it would destroy almost everything in front of him. Abel's strength was about 2,000 pounds, with an incomplete bonus of 3,000 pounds using the Wolf Rider's rifle. Alongside with the elite knight being already wounded, he doubted the knight could even reach 2,000 pounds. When the spear and the sword collided, the elite knight's sword directly flew off, but Abel's long spear did not stop. The long spear flashed a green light as it pierced through the elite knight's armor. It was like a thin piece of cloth being poked with a blade of green light. Soon, it had penetrated the elite knight's body and went out from the other side. With an ear-piercing shout, Abel threw the elite knight out of his spear directly to the directions where Prince Wyatt was running towards. Another elite knight was covering Prince Wyatt as he ran towards the horse, heard a sound, and looked back. To his surprise, he saw the dead body of his fellow knight come flying over. The other elite knight couldn't think of how was this possible. It all took place in a few blinks of an eye. Even an injured elite knight could not be killed in such a short period of time. That elite knight did not use his sword to block the body as it would risk damaging it, so he just used his let it fly directly towards him. The moment the corpse came in contact with him, he finally understood why his fellow knight was killed in seconds. The force was so great that the High Knight's body flew nearly a dozen meters flat, smashing Prince Wyatt to the ground as he limped toward the horse. Abel moved closer and closer to Prince Wyatt with his long spear, which sparkled in green light as he howled. The elite knight who had risen on his feet did not get any more injuries as the attack was blocked by Prince Wyatt, who was knocked to the ground and immediately fainted. At it Novel Benedat. The elite knight's eyes twinkled and his mouth whispered, "Are you a Wolf Rider from the Wolf family?" The Wolf family's Wolf Rider spear skill was a secret that was not allowed to be spread other than their family members. If any other orcs had learned these skills, they would be hunted by them. The Wolf family's number 11 long spear technique was infamous in the orcs and human world. Countless enemies had died in the face of this technique during battles. That flash of green light in the long spear along with the howl was their signature. Abel didn't listen and didn't want to say anything. No matter orc or human, he did not want to stop the spell. With Abel being 2 ranks lower than the elite knight, his only advantage was his tremendous strength. When it comes to fighting techniques, he was still miles behind. In terms of knight training, Abel had less than 1 year of experience. His time of becoming an actual knight was even shorter than that. For a rookie like him, a small mistake in these kinds of battles would lead to the death of Abel. The elite knight felt that his strength was draining away as he continued to lose blood, and he couldn't wait anymore. A swirl of combat chi flew out from his big sword. This was the elite knight's long-distance combat chi attack. Abel couldn't help but quickly step back. In the face of an attack like this, Abel had no choice but to keep stepping back and try his best to slash away the combat with his green long spear. Luckily, this Royal Wargen technique lived up to its name. Every time the combat chi had gotten near him, he could always slash it away, which allowed him to keep stepping away. The attacks of the elite knight were getting weaker and weaker. With his vicious use of combat chi, the blood spilled even quicker out of his body. He made a final long-distance combat chi attack to Abel, and his combat chi was drained. This was a chance that Abel would not let go. The horizontally swept with his green long spear, sending the elite knight flying off his feet. However, instead of following up with the knight, Abel walked up to Prince Wyatt. At that time, Prince Wyatt began to slowly wake up from the concussion. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the terrifying face of a war gen. No, don't kill me. Prince Wyatt did not care about anything else but preserving his life at this point. He would even embarrass himself just to beg for mercy to live. Abel was a wolf rider. In the human world, the orcs were every human's enemy. Abel had never heard of a human begging for mercy to an orc. Prince Wyatt was a knight, and as a knight who was begging to the orcs for mercy, Abel couldn't help but mutter in his mind, "Traitor." He had betrayed the dignity of being a human. "Dear Prince, your Majesty, everything you have done to my uncle, I will now take your life in return." The human language suddenly came out from Wargen Abel's mouth. You are a human." Prince Wyatt suddenly realized, which he proceeded to promptly exclaim, "You are Abel, the Abel. I recognize your voice. Looks like I can't leave any evidence behind." Abel had a murderous look on his face. Then he took the spear out of his hand and aimed at the Prince Wyatt's throat. "No, please don't kill me." Prince Wyatt, stunned by the cold from the tip of the rifle, as he pleaded softly for mercy, then screamed, I don't know you. Be a good man next life." There was a flash of green light from the tip of the gun, and Prince Wyatt's throat was pierced. The pleading look on his face was suddenly gone. Looking coldly at Prince Wyatt on the ground, Abel shook off the blood on the tip of the gun. He then went over to the elite knight who was shot 10 meters away to investigate if he was still breathing. Shortly after, Abel called White Cloud once he observed that he was still alive. When Abel was returning to the castle, he asked White Cloud to fly as high as possible. After an hour, Abel appeared back in Harry's castle as he made a rare trip to the Blacksmith Guild to exchange some forging knowledge with Master Bentham. The news of Prince Wyatt's death was quickly sent back to him by the knight that Abel spared. When the king heard about Wyatt's accident, he immediately fainted due to sadness. The appearance of the Wolf Rider also frightened several nearby towns. Due to the high demand for guards, it made the mercenary in a few cities very rich. When the nobles were talking about what had happened to Prince Wyatt, many of them thought he deserved what had happened to him. However, the noble court of honor did give in due to the death of the prince. According to the words of the spirit, if a convict did not eliminate their crime, their spirit could not return to the Holy Continent. As for the Lord of Marshall's assassination attempt, a villa in Beikong City with a value of 100,000 gold coins was taken from the deceased Prince Wyatt and given to the Lord of Marshall for compensation. "I hope his soul can return to heaven," said the Lord of Marshall respectfully when he received the documents for the villa. It seemed that he had already forgiven what Prince Wyatt had done to him. Not only that, but he could even say these words of honor, hoping the prince's soul may rest in peace. This action deeply touched the few royal secretaries who delivered the documents. The Lord of Marshall legendary modesty, bravery, and justice was really not just in vain. Abel knew personally that Lord Marshall was very pleased with the villa he revived was worth 100,000 gold coins. He knew that it would produce an annual income for Harry's castle. After this event, their lives seemed to go back to normal, and everything was calm once again. This event had intensified the tension between the royal family and the nobles. Alongside with King's health recovering, the conflict on the surface of the kingdom sank to the bottom again. In Abel's room, other than doing night training, Abel had spent all his time dwelling his table, drawing sketches of all kinds of armors from this world and his previous world. He had used up almost 10 sheets of lambskin. Lambskin was very expensive. They were all made by young lambs and cost around half a gold coin each. Therefore, everyone who could afford one would use it very carefully. Of course, you can get cheaper ones, but those have been mixed with the skin of rabbits, and nobles would not use them. Nothing could match the softness and ease of use of these skins from a young lamb. Moreover, the most important thing to a noble was their face, so they would never use a fake lambskin no matter how poor they were. Their ink pens were normally made by the single thickest strand of feathers from the wings of a mature swan. After the feather had been plucked from the swan, it was steamed to melt off the fat within. Then, the heated feather would be plunged into a bowl of sand. After it had been cooled down naturally, it would be installed with an ink tube and pen tip. At last, a small hole would be open around 1 millimeter at the tip of the pen, and that's how these swan feather ink pens were made. Abel was getting used to the writing equipment of this world. He fully understood what could happen if writing paper was invented, and as an enthusiast of ancient history, Abel would never try to invent such a thing and try to change this world. The invention of paper was spread from the east to the west, which made almost an unlimited amount of information accessible to normal citizens and allowed society to rapidly develop. This world had already gone through tens of thousands of years of holy continent history, but Abel never heard of anyone coming up with any inventions similar to paper. Therefore, through his speculation, this world rarely changed, and their culture was almost in a stale state. Abel was very satisfied with his current status in this world. The only thing that he cared about was his family and friends. With the secret he possessed, he would not try to change its culture. The only reason he had locked himself up in his room for 3 days was to come up with armor for his Lord Award with the king in 2 months. In a significant event like this, the quality of the armor was very important to every knight who was about to be awarded. It was a way to show their wealth and power to the citizens, fighting ability to the nobles, and bravery to the king. The 10 sheets of land were filled with sketches of the armors which Abel had learned to make. However, he was not satisfied. He wanted something more special. Since Abel was still very young, his body has not been fully developed. With the training of knights and his increase in strength since he had become an official knight, he was already a lot taller than most kids his age. He was 1.7 meters, which was the normal height of a normal adult. However, it was different for knights. Since all the food they ate was the best of quality and the training they undergo was the most well-rounded, normally their height would reach at least 1.9 meters. So, normal knight armors were made according to the height of 1.9 meters. Since Abel was only 13 years old, he would be fine with just a simple armor for temporary use. For the Lord of Martial, his favorite armor was that blazing sunset armor. Although, he would often take it out from the storage to polish it, and it was considered as very flashy in Harvest City. If he wore it to Beikong City, the capital of the Duchy of Carmel, it might seem a bit out of date. Abel wanted the Lord of Martial to wear the most perfect armor in the time of his life, in front of his friends and family in Beikong City. The design of armors of his previous world used to be similar to the ones in this world. However, due to modernizations and the influence of movies and anime, the armor design of his previous world had become extraordinary. Countless cosplayers had tried to replicate those armors with different materials. They released countless design sketches. Some had even designed a CAD model. Since Abel's power of the will had increased, if he tried to quiet down, he could remember all of those designs from his previous world very clearly. As a person, he had been bombarded with information from the internet. Countless armor designs appeared in his mind. The elves' armor in The Lord of the Rings seemed to look good. It could fully express the slim and androgynous body of the elves. The elf-style engraving also seemed to look luxurious, but there was one big problem. It was not very productive, so Abel scrapped this idea. Then, the Warrior of Light's blue armor from Final Fantasy popped into Abel's mind. The armor had spikes on its shoulder blade, which looked very cool. However, its skin-tight design was a bit hard to achieve. How could he go to the Lord of Martial and tell him to take off his clothes to let him measure his body? Had it novel been at? When the other blacksmith had already begun to construct their armors, Abel was still trying to choose one from his sea of designs. Suddenly, another armor had popped into Abel's mind. He could clearly remember the measurements and the CAD model of it, which was the armor of Saint Seiya, Knight of the Zodiac's golden armor. In total, there were 12 parts to this armor. This was the armor of the Taurus. It was that it has 2 forms. One was in the form of a Taurus standing on all 4s, and the other form was on a bodysuit, which also looked like Taurus. This Taurus armor consisted of a cow horn helmet, sharp shoulder pads, chest protector, back protector, waist protector, arm guards, leg guards, and shoes. Abel built the armor entirely out of 120 skills iron base. Since he had the blueprint memorized, the forging process went very smooth. He thickened the front of the helmet and the back protection of the armor. At last, a pile of gray iron armor parts was scattered on the floor of the operating room. As Abel stared at these gray iron parts of the armor, he couldn't help but feel like it looked very different from the shiny gold one he had imagined. Gray was the natural color of iron. Although the quality was top-notch, the color looked quite ugly. There was other interesting equipment in Abel's operation room. For example, he was about to use the foot pedal polisher, which he often uses to polish his finest work. This thing held rapid spinning power by attaching a conveyor belt to the turntable. During the polishing process, whetstone was placed on the turntable as burnish, which was secured by straps of leather. Abel had created this machine, so he didn't have to do hand polish. This machine could save him a lot of time, and the result was a lot better as well. Abel picked up the parts of the armor one by one and placed them on the machine to polish, and then burnish. Soon the surface of the parts was completely smoothed, shining in cold lights. Although the color was still not perfect, it was much better than before. The material he was about to use had toxic mercury inside them. Therefore, Abel had worn a face mask for safety. He took out the gold leaves Steward Lindsay had brought and cut them into long, thin strips. Afterward, he threw them into the furnace and added some mercury. Abel then used a gold rod to stir. After the gold leaves had completely dissolved into the mercury, he put them into a bowl of cold water for cooling. Soon the mercury had become a silvery gold paste. As Abel looked at the silvery gold paste, suddenly, he was struck with an idea. Could these gold paste count as a liquid? What if I combine them? Will I get better ones? Since Abel was spoiled with money, he decided to shove the 3 chunks of silvery gold paste into the Horadric Cube. After he pressed the start button, the 3 chunks of paste disappeared, and soon a dark-style crystal glass appeared inside the cube. Within the glass was some dark gold paste. Abel took out the dark gold paste from the Horadric Cube and closely examined it. Although he didn't know how the Horadric Cube ranked different liquid, he knew this dark gold paste he was holding was the most perfect and their highest quality. He mixed the gold paste with salt and alum until it became liquid. Then, he painted it on top of the parts of the armor. Afterward, he placed these parts of the armor on top of the furnace. He continued to spin them until their surface began to shine in gold, and soon, the mercury had been expelled. He continued to heat the armor parts on top of the furnace. As more and more mercury had been expelled, the gold of the parts became even shinier. Not sure if it's because this gold paste was combined into Horadric Cube, it was shining in a unique, yet eye-catching tone. The surface looked perfect, it was flawless even without any touch-ups. Abel did not care about the manufacturing cost. He continued with his gold paste formula for 3 more times. At least all the parts of the armor were shining in gold. Abel put the leftover gold paste into a jar, so he could use it for repairing the armor in the future. The armor had been forged. Afterward, he installed a diamond and began to draw the 12 #Thor rune with his rune pen onto the armor. The only step left was to ask the tailor and cobbler of the castle to design the lining of this armor. It took Abel 10 days of harsh labor to complete this armor. It was the longest time he had ever spent on. In the next 3 days, Abel had forged himself a full body worth of equipment. They included armor, a shield, and a knight's spear. The armor was forged according to the traditional formula of this world. It was painted with blue on the outer layer, which suited Abel's age. He also drew the 12 #Thor rune on top of it and installed a diamond into a gap of the armor. Although the orcs had taken the blame for the prince's assassination, he was still worried that the royals would give him trouble for what he had done to the prince previously. Therefore, he must have adequate protection. After the process of becoming a lord had completed, Abel could demand his coat of arms. That way he could wear 2 medals when he attended any official events, his own coat of arm medal, and the blacksmith master medal. The knight's spear was an exaggeration big sword. It has a length of 5 meters. It looked like a long square pyramid, sharp at the top, thick at the bottom, which was equipped with a large surrounding handguard. Inside was the handle. This was not those ordinary one-time use wooden knight spear. It was made entirely out of 120 skills iron base with able enormous strength. This knight spear weighs more than 300 pounds. On top of that, it was equipped with the 4 #Nef rune, which could rumble off an enemy. This knight spear could be a nightmare for any opponent. Just imagine if someone was fighting against Abel in a battlefield. They would be continuously knocked back by this knight spear's special ability along with Abel's enormous strength. Every time they got knocked backward, Abel would have more time to execute his knight charging technique and knight acceleration technique. The power of these techniques would just more powerful with each strike. Therefore, under these conditions, Abel's opponents would be continuously knocked backward while being strike until their life had come to an end. Although Abel had already simplified his armor and could only equip himself with his original ice magic sword. If anyone was to purchase this equipment in the market, its value would still be an astronomical number. At this point, Abel just wished his Mount Wolf Black Wind could grow up faster. If he could ride Black Wind while equipped with this equipment, it would be perfect. The little Mount Wolf Black Wind had entered its rapid growth phase after it had been cast with the Mount Strengthening spell. Now its difference in size could be seen every day. During the morning, Abel brought 2 ice magic swords and 2 fire magic swords to Harvest City on his carriage. The Lord of Marshall was concerned about the orcs' attack, so he strongly demanded Abel to bring at least a brigade of 6 beginner warriors along with him. Although the beginner warriors' fighting ability were not as great as knights, they could still use combat chi. Every single one of these 6 warriors was personally recruited by the Lord of Marshall from the battle force. They were all around the age of 40, which was the prime time of warriors. Abel couldn't explain to the Lord of Marshall that there wasn't actually any orc attack. However, he felt that the fewer people who knew about the attack on the royal family, the better. The blame had been pushed to the Wirgins anyways. Therefore, from now on, every time he goes outside, he would need to bring a brigade of warriors with him. When Abel was approaching Edmund's auction house, the shop assistant immediately noticed the hairy castle coat of arms on the carriage from a distance. As soon as Abel got off the carriage, Ms. Yvette was already standing in front of the carriage waiting for him. "Edmund's auction house welcomes you, Lord Abel." Ms. Yvette then bent her knee and gave a quick salute. She was treating Abel with more and more respect. This miraculous teenager had become one of the most well-known people in Harvest City and was a godly role model for the child of every family. Abel felt very fortunate he could take on this role. "Thank you for the welcoming, Ms. Yvette." Abel then waved at the guards to take out the 4 magical weapons from the carriage trunk, which were wrapped in orc skin. At it novel Benedette. When Lady Yvette saw the package, her eyes were filled with excitement. Since the attack on the Lord of Marshall, as well as the killing of Prince Wyatt, the value of Abel's magic weapon would increase. Now, they had become the focus of all nobles, auctioning around the price of 50,000 gold coins. "Lord Abel, please come into the VIP lounge." Ms. Yvette saluted to Abel and led him into the VIP lounge. A guard was following closely behind, carrying the package. When they entered the lounge, the guard quickly placed the package on the table and left. Though she was extremely eager to see the magical weapons that Abel brought, she still poured a cup of coffee for Abel very politely. She waited patiently until he took a few sips before asking, "May I know why you are stopping by at our boutique shop today?" "I was very pleased with the last business with your boutique shop. This time I brought my latest batch of the magic weapon," said Abel, opening the package on the table and revealing 2 ice magic swords and 2 fire magic swords. "Was it Prince Wyatt who bought the magic sword identified by Master Thorin Oakenshield?" asked Yvette in a very concerned tone. The headquarters had repeatedly urged her to close another deal with Abel, hoping they would sell his magic weapons in Edmund's boutique shop. Moreover, Abel's magic weapon was a hot topic recently, which meant nobles will try to spend a large sum of money just to get their hands on one of them. Even if a knight didn't buy it, someone would probably buy it for their reputation. Yes, these 4 magic swords, 2 ice magic, and 2 fire magic. They are all made with the 120 skills iron base. Abel replied, "Lord Abel, you may rest assured that none of them will be below Master Thorin Oakenshield's estimate when they were in the hands of Edmund." We at Edmunds can assure you of that, and your sale will be free of charge. Ms. Yvette didn't have that authority, but the message from headquarters demanded that she had to close a deal with Abel at all costs. So they gave her the most power in the matter. Edmund's boutique shop didn't really need to make any money off this auction. The attention they could attract from the fame of Abel was more than enough to bring profits to their shop. Since Master would only become even more famous in the future if they would maintain Abel as their supplier, their boutique shop would be famous too. I'm very pleased with your service, Ms. Yvette. Abel accepted Ms. Yvette's offer with a smile. As it was the first time this kind of ice magic sword had been offered for auction, Abel explained to Ms. Yvette the power of the ice magic sword. He flicked the blade of the sword with his finger. It flashed a blue light, and soon his finger was filled with a layer of frost. Abel then proceeded to say, "The ice sword can attack enemies with two effects. One is to slow them down, with the frosting power of the sword. The other is the damage caused by the ice magic. Although it was not too powerful, if this ice magic was injected into the body of a person, it would be even more difficult to remove than combat chi. What a powerful weapon." Ms. Yvette, who is not a professional, but she worked at a boutique shop. Therefore, she understood the properties of many weapons and what slowing an opponent down in a battle could do. "Ms. Yvette, I need to buy some more potions. Please give me 27 blood fusing potions, 270 replenishing potions, and 162 essence condensing potions." Abel was going to buy another month's worth of potion, which was a lot for any person. "Lord Abel, I'll send you these potions immediately. It will cost 20,250 gold coins." At first, there were some doubts about the fact of Ms. Yvette, but it had quickly disappeared. At that moment, Abel felt a sense of relief in his heart again. Sure enough, his large purchases of night potions were very notable. It's enough for a normal knight to use more than 2 years, although it was a lot. Luckily, it didn't send too much shock to Ms. Yvette. Soon more than 400 bottles of the potion were brought out in a leather dome box. When Abe finished paying with his magic gold card, the figure was cut in half again. The card showed a number of 31,500 gold coins. Until his next auction, he could another month worth of potion. Of course, although this amount of potion was enough for more than 2 years of consumption for normal knights, Abel could finish it in 1 day. However, Abel was no longer in a hurry. His speed of development had already been very impressive, so Abel decided to take it slow, only use the potions in large doses when the necessary time arrived. As Abel was coming out from a VIP lounge, he overheard the sound of various voices chatting. When he looked over, businessmen were chatting in the resting room of the boutique shop. "Have you seen the Lord of Marshall's golden armor?" "At novel been at?" "Not at all, but I've heard people talked about." "Well, I saw him yesterday, and it completely dazzled my eyes. He came to Harvest City with his golden armor. When he got off his Inferno bull carriage, a ray of sunlight reflected off his armor. It was shining so brightly that I could barely even see his figure. Weren't the armor of Prince Wyatt's guards also gold some time ago? It's nothing compared to that. The materials of that armors were like brass compared to the armor of Lord Marshall." When Abel heard the conversation, he knew that his beloved Uncle Marshall had taken his carriage and the Taurus armor to Harvest City to show off. However, what these businessmen were saying was true. The Royal Guard golden armor was mixed with a lot of brass to display a golden color. Although this lowered their armor protection, their dignity was more important, so a little loss of defense didn't matter to them. "Lord Abel, it would be extremely popular if you put up for sale the same armor that the Lord of Marshall was wearing," Ms. Yvette suggested to Abel, whispering towards him. Abel chuckled, waved his hand, and said, "That suit of armor took too long and took too much effort to forge. I don't think I will be making another one for a while." Abel had decided not to sell any items that were identified as golden rank by Master Soren Oakshield. From Master Soren's speech, he felt that these golden rank equipment were extremely valuable. People would have doubted the person who was selling where they had acquired their materials from. Furthermore, the costs of this equipment were extremely expensive and not many people could even afford them. Hearing Abel's excuses, Ms. Yvette didn't attempt to persuade him anymore. Amid the enthusiastic sound of Ms. Yvette's farewell, Abel left Edmund's boutique shop to regroup with the guards. Abel then went to all the stores selling potions in Harvest City and bought a second group of potions that could be combined into a single dose. When he was finished, there was only 11,250 gold left in his magic card. Young master, the Lord has been searching everywhere for you to see him. He is waiting for you at another courtyard. Elliot, one of the knight brigades of Harry's castle, galloped over and dismounted his horse to salute to Abel. Elliot, how did you find me? Abel asked strangely, bowing slightly. The Lord's Guard and Knight Brigade are all out looking for you. I'm just the first one who found, explained the Knight of Elliot. Looking at the Knight of Elliot's worried facial expression, Abel immediately began to wonder why the Lord of Marshall was in such a hurry to find him. So he hurried back into his carriage and, under the protection of the guards, rushed back to Harry Castle's courtyard in Harvest City. Abel, here you are, said the Lord of Marshall, taking a few steps with a gloomy face, as he pulled Abel out of the carriage. Uncle Marshall, what happened? Abel asked quickly. Do you remember the elite knight of Soroyan? Lord Marshall asked, without answering Abel. Yes, of course. He led the campaign against the orcs and won the battle. He gained a knight's estate afterward, too. Although they had met only once, Abel was impressed by the elite knight of Soroyan and his modesty. Well, something has happened to him, Lord Marshall said quietly, his eyes showing a hint of sadness. Since the last time we met at the Lord's house, the two have been hanging out with each other several times, which they became close friends. Though the Knight of Soroyan was only an elite knight, there weren't many elite knights within Harvest City, as well as Soroyan being the commander of 1,000 elite troops. How would he be in any trouble? Abel then looked doubtful at Marshall. The elite knight of Soroyan had been busy with the construction of his domain recently. The moment that his castle was restored, he was attacked by wolf riders, which meant no one was able to get out of the castle. A servant who went to the city to purchase food discovered the attack and quickly reported to Harvest City. But when the reinforcements have arrived, the battle was already over. The Knight of Soroyan was dead, and his head was taken away by the wolf riders. Lord Marshall gritted his teeth as he struggled in recounting the situation to Abel. Would this be the wolf riders' revenge? Abel was a little surprised. He suddenly thought of the wolf family's wolf riders. Did it happen because of Fowler's death? From what remains of the castle, it seemed that there was only one orc there, with the majority of them being wolf riders. They weren't ordinary wolf riders, because they were able to kill an elite knight. The Lord of Marshall then looked over at Abel and said, "This must be the revenge of the wolf riders." The last campaign probably meant a noble wolf rider was killed. With Soroyan being the commander of the battle, he and all his men in the castle were slaughtered for revenge. So, does this mean our castle is in danger? Abel finally realized why Marshall was so eager to find him. Let's get back to the castle. We need to strengthen its defense and get ready to fight against the wolf riders. Lord Marshall's voice sounded very calm. However, since Abel had been through life and death battles, he could feel the murderous spirit hidden within the Lord of Marshall's voice. Can the ruler of the city send some knights to help us defend? Abel felt it would have been extremely dangerous if the wolf riders were able to attack a castle and kill an elite knight. Although he was not afraid of the wolf riders, the civilians of the castle weren't able to defend themselves against them. It was best to have as many guards as possible. When the ruler of the city heard about this attack, he immediately summoned all the knights he had available, alongside with elite ranking mercenaries from the mercenary union, to defend Harvest City. The Lord was extremely anxious about wolf riders making Harvest City as their main target. That's why they can't send anyone to help us. The Lord of Marshall understood the city ruler's arrangement, but he was not pleased that he was not able to send any help at all. Sending a few knights from Harvest City wouldn't have much effect on the defense of Harvest City anyways. Moreover, Lord Marshall was certain that the wolf riders would never send a large number of their elite troops to the depth of the human world, because if their campaign had failed, the loss of these elite troops would cause a massive blow to the status of the wolf rider race in the Orc Empire. No matter orcs or humans, they were both very valuable for highly trained soldiers. It was extremely difficult and required a lot of resources to train every single one of them. It would have depleted all of their family's resources, even for middle-class families. This was why the orcs were throwing so many new orc warriors into the human world, but so few elite warriors into the human world. Although the fertility of the orcs was very strong, the resources of the Orc Empire were very limited. Every year, there would be a large number of orc warriors participating in the life and trial of death in hopes of attaining resources. The Orc Empire used this test to eliminate the weaker orcs. By doing so, not only would reduce the consumption of resources, but it also helped in selecting elite soldiers to expand the army. As the Lord of Marshall had speculated, there shouldn't be too many elite wolf riders traveling to the human world this time. The reason why the elite knight of Soroya had failed was probably because he was trapped in his castle, unable to get on his war horse. Although his fighting ability might still be a bit stronger than normal warriors since the knight's training was so much better, he still could not fully express the knight techniques he was expertise in. The wolf riders had some of the strongest mounts around. Maybe only 2 elite wolf rider could take down the trapped knight of Soroya. The strength of these knights relied mostly on their superior numbers. The power they unleashed would be multiplied if there were more knights. A knight could face a wolf rider, and 10 knights would have easily defeat 50 wolf riders as long as they're given time to charge. The survival ability of a lone knight was much lower. Preparing for a possible battle, Abel said to the Knight Brigade, "Elliot, please help me buy small gems in bulk and send it back to Harry's castle as soon as possible." As he spoke, Abel placed his hands on the Horadric Cube inside his coat and took 500 gold coins and placed them into a money bag to give to Elliot. "Yes, master." Elliot did not inquire about the purpose of the gems, but quickly took the coins and rode away. When the Lord of Marshall and Abel returned to Harry's castle, they found it safe and looked at each other with a sigh of relief. In regards to Abel Castle, there shouldn't be any worries since it was mostly empty. Moreover, very few people knew that the previous Marshall Castle had now become the Abel Castle. Before Abel's lord title was officially declared by the king, no outsider would even know that he had gained a fiefdom. As Abel went back to his room, he began to think about what he could do to prevent these wolf riders from taking revenge. He knew that even if he decided to hand them back the Holy Wolf's treasure, it still wouldn't guarantee that they would stop seeking their revenge. The reason why Abel had sent the Knight of Elliot to purchase those small gems was because he was planning to replenish all the used-up exploding big sword in the Horadric Cube. For the worst scenario, he was also planning to prepare a super exploding big sword made with a perfect gem, which would unleash mutual destruction if necessary. Of course, that was only Abel's worst-case scenario, but it was only a matter of time. Some while ago, Abel had an idea about that exploding big sword. He wanted to test whether if it was possible to extend the duration of the explosion. However, as Abel was busy with other things, this project seemed to have drifted off his mind. Suddenly, a faint sound of knocking came from outside the door, dong, dong, dong. Abel could tell it was the maid who was outside. The maids were professionally trained, and there was a fixed rule about their knocks. On weekdays, 2 knocks meant an ordinary matter. However, 3 knocks means there was an urgent matter for Abel. "Come in," Abel said while looking at the door. "The Lord of Marshall is waiting for you downstairs." "Young master," said the maid, bending her knees while saluting towards Abel. When Abel heard the news, he walked straight past the maid and directly down the stairs, although he felt a bit disrespectful afterward. As soon as Abel had walked down the stairs, he heard a group of voices said in unison, "Hello, young Master Abel." To his surprise, there was a team of 20 knight servants with the hairy family coat of arms standing behind the Lord of Marshall. They were all equipped with full body armor. Abel carefully examined these knight servants. Each of them was at least 40 years old or older. From their imposing manner, they seemed to be the most kick-ass group of beginner warriors. Abel never knew that Harry's castle had a team of knight servants like this. He could only recognize around 3 to 4 faces. Other than that, Abel had never seen any of them in his life before. Knight servants were also known as reserve knights. They were generally no more than 20 years old. They would often learn by the side of a knight while serving them, maintaining the weapons as well as taking care of the warhorse. Since knight servants were considered much nobler than ordinary people, a large number of soldiers decided to become a knight's servant for the status. Furthermore, knights required someone that knows how to fight to assist them, which meant that these knight servants were ranked higher than the noble bodyguards. Abel, all the knight servants here are the ones I have brought back from the war against the orcs. We are all brothers who would live and die together. Since they have given everything to me, I will trust them with all my will. Today, the castle is in danger, and I will put this team in your hand. I hope you can arm them as much as possible. The Lord of Marshall said in a serious tone. The Lord of Marshall was afraid that Abel would not have the leadership skills to control Harry's castle, so he warned him in advance now. Abel then turned to the 20 knights and asked softly, "Can I trust you?" While Abel didn't speak loudly, these knights in the castle hall were able to hear every word of Abel clearly. They then bent down on their knees and shouted in unison, "Lord Abel, we dare to die for the Harry family." From calling him Master Abel to Lord Abel, these 20 knights servants had sworn their allegiance to the heir of the family. The oath of allegiance was considered as a very big decision in this world, and very few people would break it. Afterward, Abel quickly pointed towards Elliot, whom he knew well. "Elliot, come here and take off all your gear. Let me check them first." The knight's servant, Elliot, took a step forward and saluted to Abel. "Yes, my lord." With that, Elliot stripped off his gear one by one and placed it in front of Abel. Abel first picked up the helmet. He looked and gently tapped its surface. The bowler hat, also known as the skull cap, was made from 3 pieces of iron. The helmet's craftsmanship was very average as Abel examined it carefully. Then he picked up the leather armor, which was on the heavier side. Its surface was covered with small pieces of iron. This was typical armor, and it seemed to have a decent defense. The right-hand weapon was a one-handed long sword with 80 skills. When Abel held it on his hands, he quickly realized that it was the work of Gedden, who was one of Master Bentham's apprentice. It was carefully crafted, and the quality was very good as well. The left-hand weapon was a round shield, which was also made of 80 skills iron base, and also the work of Gedden. It didn't seem to be very big. It would not only not get in the way during attacks, but it could also effectively protect the important positions on the body. Everybody put down your swords and shields. Elliot, get 2 men to bring the sword and shield to my operation room. Abel ordered. The quality of the weapons and shields that these knight servants used were good enough. They meet the basic requirements for rune drafting, so Abel decided to convert them into magic weapons. After saying goodbye to the Lord of Marshall, Abel took out his rune pen and ink from upstairs, as well as the large bag of broken gems that was brought back by Elliot. He then took all of these stuff into his operations room. In the operations room, knight servant Elliot had already placed his sword and shield in the empty space of the operations room. He then stood on the side with his hands bound, as he waited for Abel's orders. "Don't let anyone bother me while I'm making magic weapons," said Abel. "Yes, Lord Abel." When Elliot went out, he immediately called the other 19 knights to the door of the operations room. They did not know whether Abel's process of making magic weapons was dangerous or not, so knight servants would not let anyone get anywhere close to Abel. They basically blocked the entire operating room entirely. One could only access it if all 19 knights died. In the operations room, Abel first combined a bunch of small broken stones into ordinary stones. He realized the price the Knight of Elliot had paid was much cheaper than the price he normally pay. It seemed like buying things with the noble title was a scam. He then combined a bunch of red gem into a piece of perfect red gem. This was in preparation for the super exploding big sword. The next step was to make magic weapons. Abel was about to draw a rune on a non-self-made weapon for the first time. Previously, he had full control over every single process of making his magic weapons, from forging the iron base to the rune drawing. Abel picked up a single-handed long sword made by Gedden with his hand. He used his power of will to carefully inspect for any small mistakes. There was a minor flaw, but it shouldn't matter too much. After inspecting the weapon, Abel realized the items that were left over from the previous days had made quite a mess on the operations table. Abel then flicked his hand and threw the single-handed long sword into the Horadric Cube. After tidying up the mess on the operations table, Abel's spirit sank into the Horadric Cube. He was about to retrieve the one-handed long sword. However, a startling scene stopped him. When Abel's power of the will rested on the one-handed long sword in the Horadric Cube, a set of characters appeared on its surface. It was in Chinese. At this moment, Abel almost shed tears, such a familiar language. For so long, he almost seemed to forget about his previous world. There was a fear in Abel's heart that he would forget about his past. He was afraid of forgetting about his original parents, friends, and everything about his old world. He had already forgotten the faces of some of his old friends, and he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to remember his parents' faces one day. The Horadric Cube that came with him into this world was his only hope in remembering his past. It was the foundation of his peaceful existence in this world. With the cube beside him, he felt that his previous world was almost supporting him. Since Chinese characters had appeared once again, his doubt has been confirmed. The Horadric Cube really did come from his previous world. The Chinese characters were all white and red. One-handed sword normal. Single hand damage 2 to 3. Durability 21 by 24. Abel was shocked to realize that the Horadric Cube was able to display the properties of a weapon. Although not as fully equipped as Diablo II, this world was a real world, and it made sense that it was completely different from the world of the game. Nevertheless, Abel was very happy to see that the statistics of these weapons were being displayed. But how come the weapons he put in the Horadric Cube before never displayed any properties? No one could answer Abel. After careful speculation, there could only be two reasons. One reason might be that every weapon he had shoved in the Horadric Cube before was forged by himself. Another reason might be that since his power of the will had increased tremendously, it unlocked more features. Abel threw his ice magic sword into his Horadric Cube. His power of the will was fully fixed on it, and soon a message appeared. Big Sword of Frost normal. Single hand damage 3 to 7. Durability 24-24. +1 to 2 ice damage. Effect lasts for 2 seconds. The words Big Sword of Frost normal was written in a bold blue font. It was unlike the single-hand longsword before, which was entirely white. Turns out that single-hand longsword was considered as a white weapon, and this ice magic sword was considered as blue weapons, also known as magic weapons. When Abel saw the font of the word Frost that appeared, he noticed it was the same style of font as the one from Diablo II. Frost, meaning damage caused by ice magic. However, the original property of 10 #thul rune suggested +3 to 14 ice damage. The effect lasts for 3 seconds. Ice defense increased by 30%. Due to the material used in the rune ink and the big sword, the effect remained at 1 to 2 damage, and it lasts for 1 second less. Abel had no idea how he could increase the power of this rune. The new discovery had given Abel a lot of motivation. He picked up the single-hand long sword with a tong and threw it into the furnace. After it had been heated, he took it out and put a hole in it. He then repeated this process for 19 more times and ended up with 20 single-hand long swords with holes. Since he was in a hurry, and he did not rest at all during this process, the process of writing runes was very smooth as well. Since his power of the will had increased tremendously, he could draw runes on 5 of these long swords before taking a rest. Just like that, he only spent the night, ruthlessly working until noon of the next day before all 20 long swords were finished. Since Abel had been working non-stop, during lunchtime he sat in the dining hall of Harry Castle, viciously munching on a big bowl of leopard meat. The Lord of Marshall understood the reason behind Abel's lack of table manners, so he did not say a thing. He only looked at the often well-mannered Abel gorging his food with a smile. "Uncle Marshall, I'm a little hungry today," said Abel as he noticed the attention of the Lord of Marshall. He suddenly realized the way he was eating was lacking in manners. Manners were very important on the dining table of nobles, and Abel was a bit ashamed of himself. Normally, Abel was very careful when it came to small details like these. He had been in this world for more than 2 years. Although he took precaution in the beginning, now he found himself fitting in quite well. It was only after a day of intense labor, when his power of the will could no longer function, did he forget about this little detail of manner. "Don't worry about it. That's my boy," the Lord of Marshall exclaimed. Since Abel had arrived at Harry Castle, everything he did was very mature, so he had never been a worry to the Lord of Marshall. Because of this, the Lord of Marshall never really had any parenthood experience. When the topic of Abel came up during the conversations with his friends, he would always just say that Abel was very well behaved. He could not fully express the impose of being a stepfather. The Knight of Bennett and the Lord of Marshall held a similar place in Abel's heart. When the Knight of Bennett first suggested that he wanted Abel to be adopted by the Lord of Marshall, Abel did not resist too much. This was because the Abel currently did not want to just replace the old Abel, and by being adopted by the Lord of Marshall, he could fully become the new Abel, an Abel that was more true to himself. "Uncle Marshall, I am no longer a child," Abel emphasized. In this world, a 13-year-old was considered a young adult. He would not allow anyone to call him a kid. This was another way for Abel to come across as he had fully fit into this world. If he was still on Earth, the adult Abel would never say such a thing. "You are right, you are not a kid," said the Lord of Marshall, while laughing loudly. "How are the magic weapons going?" asked the Lord of Marshall with a caring tone. If things continued to escalate, it seemed like the Wolf Rider might attack Harry Castle in 2 days. The latest news from the scouts stated that a small group of Wolf Rider was roaming around outside Harvest City. But the Lord of Marshall's experience told him that this was probably just the Wolf Riders' plan to keep the Harvest City military forces within the surrounding Harvest City. Viscount Dickens must have noticed this too, but he could not take the risk. Therefore, he was damned to continue guarding Harvest City with all his military force. However, the Lord of Marshall was wrong to blame Viscount Dickens. In reality, Viscount Dickens sensed the presence of a Wolf Rider who possessed the same fighting ability as a commander knight roaming outside the city walls. That's why he was not willing to send any military force outside of Harvest City. At the same time, the head commander Wolf Rider would not show itself easily. It knew that the moment he showed himself would be the time where he would fight to the death with Viscount Dickens. This was the responsibility of Viscount Dickens. All the luxury of being a ruler of the city came with a price, and that was protecting the city and its citizens with all his will. If Viscount Dickens had sent some people to support Harry Castle, it would lower the chance of him winning against this head commander Wolf Rider. He could not take this risk for the entire city, just for the safety of a single castle. The 20 single-handed long sword was almost complete. "We should be able to give them to the knights along with a shield by tomorrow," Abel said, as he placed his cutlery on the table. "Wow, that's quick. Even though we are in a hurry, you should take care of your body too," said the Lord of Marshall. He felt like there was no way he could change Abel's crazy working style. "It's nothing compared to the time where I was making that bull carriage for you," said Abel with a smile, as he whipped the oil of his cheeks with a napkin. "At it novel Benedette." Cough, cough. The Lord of Marshall began to blush upon hearing these words of Abe. He then proceeded to say, "The past few days I've been trying to get used to my new armor and weapons. If they are as good as before, there is no way the Wolf Riders can penetrate our castle. They will pay for what they had done." Suddenly, the Lord of Marshall thought of the Knight of Soroya again. He continued to say, "The other 2 elite knights that fought against the orcs, the Knight of Bennett and the Knight of Hopper, have also been attacked. Luckily, they were prepared for it, and they safely returned to Harvest City with only some light injuries." "What a bunch of arrogant Wolf Riders," said Abel, with a slight hint of anger in his voice. This area was located in the center of the human world, so it should be the safest place for humans. However, due to the series of orcs attack, it had sent anxiety into every home around here. I had heard the news that the elites from Duchy of Carmel had been ordered come here, but still, it would take at least 3 days. So if he can stay strong in these 3 days, everything will be fine, said the Lord of Marshall. Finally, there's some good news, but 3 days are more than enough time for the Wolf Rider to finish their good deeds. Can't the elites come faster? Abel complained. The Lord of Marshall then explained, it's already the fastest they can go. The closest big city from here is Sitter City. Even for them, 3 days is very fast. The country elites who come from Beikong City might take even longer, but of course, this is one of the fastest elite recruitment. Apparently, it was a war-djinn who had killed Prince Wyatt, so King Aster George was extremely angry. When he heard that the Wurgens started to attack again, he immediately began to recruit a large number of elites from all the big cities. Abel felt an odd sense of happiness lurking within him. He was the one who actually killed a Prince Wyatt, but he successfully blamed it on the Wurgens. Now, the king wanted to seek revenge by sending help, and the person he was sending help was exactly the person who had killed his son. After Abel finished his lunch, he requested the servants to deliver the food straight to his operation room during dinner time. After he finished his dinner, he continued working again. After 20 times of diamond installation and 20 times of the power of the will guiding, 20 single-handed long swords were complete. Abel then put one of these 20 long swords into the Horadric Cube. He concentrated on it with his power of the will, and these statistics appeared. Single-handed long sword, normal. Single-handed damage, 2 to 3. Durability, 24-24. Plus 1 to 2 ice damage. Effect lasts for 2 seconds. The world's single-handed long sword, normal, was written in a bold blue font, which meant that it was a qualified magic weapon. Abel was about to draw the 12 #SOL Thor rune on to the shields. It stated that it could absorb impacts. Not only that, but Abel had discovered its ability to absorb impact was greater than the game had suggested. It took another day until Abel could finish drawing the runes and installing diamonds onto all 20 of these shields. When he threw the shield into the Horadric Cube, these statistics appeared. Absorption round shield, normal. Defense, 5. Durability, 12 of 12. Absorb physical impact, -3. Although the blue font suggested that this was a magic shield, it could not fully unleash the power of the rune and achieve the ultimate absorb physical impact, 7. Abel thought that this was a bit strange. According to what Master Soren Oakenshield had said, this shield should be considered as a golden weapon. But the Horadric Cube still showed that it was a normal magic weapon. Abel guessed, maybe this was due to the different interpretations of two worlds. Abel tried his best to resist his exhaustion. He opened the front door of the operation room and demanded that the 20 knights servants come inside. The 20 knights servants excitedly entered the legendary blacksmith master operation room. Immediately, they were stunned by the single-handed long sword and round shields that were scattered on the floor. Before they had entered, they already knew that everything in here was a magic weapon, but still, it was the first time they had seen a pile of them together. It was also the first time they had seen someone just carelessly put these magic weapons on the ground. Everyone began to pick up their long sword and shield from the ground. Although they all looked similar, every knight could clearly identify their own weapons due to their intermediate relationship with their weapons. Abel began to speak. All of these long swords were being turned into ice magic swords. When you strike your enemies with it, it will not only slow them down, but also hurt them with ice magic. In regard to the round shields, they now have the ability to absorb physical impacts. So as long as you have this shield, an elite knight or below will not be able to hurt you. Abel was still a bit unsatisfied with these shields. They were only 80 skills after all, which might not be able to withstand the attack of an elite knight, but it should be fine against anyone with an intermediate occupation. Thank you, my lord. I will pledge my life to protect the castle. The 20 knights' servants shouted in unison as they kneeled on one knee. Their eyes flashed with a fiery passion of excitement. No matter what occupation, every fighter held an ultimate passion for their weapons. Let alone a magic weapon. No, 2 magic weapons, one for attack and one for defense. Let's keep it a secret, Abel added. From the outside, it's very difficult to tell that these weapons were magic weapons. Their effects would only unleash during battles. There were actually 2 reasons why Abel wanted to keep this secret. One reason was that if people realized even knight servants could attain a piece of magic weapons, they might think they were very easy to make, therefore causing a drop in market value. Another reason, was that it was better to catch the enemies off guard. That way these weapons could fully take advantage of its power. Adet Novel Benedat. Abel let the 20 knight servants go back to defending the castle, while he went back to his room. Just like that, he rested for half a day. The intensive rune-drawing session had drained almost all energy in his body. He had pushed his power of the will to the ultimate limit. When Abel had woken up again, it was already nighttime. Immediately, he went back to the operating room. There were still 3 exploding big swords and 1 super exploding big sword he needs to finish. He already had all the material required on the spot. There was around 10 big sword of 120 skills with gem holes just casually lying on the ground. All he needed to do was to rank up the rune ink. After he converted a bunch of them into intermediate rank, he began rune drawing. The process was simple as always. As he was guiding the runes, he purposefully added some more random rune paths to it. He only installed the red gem in the last step. Abel had gotten a lot more creative this time around. He intentionally picked a fire magic sword to increase its exploding power. He also purposefully chosen the intermediate rune ink to help the fire magic spread more easily. Most of all, he had chosen the 120 skills iron base because it could make the explosion more vicious. According to the experience he gained from assassinating Prince Wyatt, the previous version of his exploding big sword could already penetrate the defense of an elite knight. Therefore, after these upgrades of the better iron base, high-quality rune ink should be able to badly injure an elite knight, if not blow the life of them. Abel emptied his Horadric Cube. He took out the scroll of Town Portal and locked it in a box. He began guiding the exploding big sword with his power of the will, as soon as the sound of shattering glass began to appear. Abel quickly shoved the exploding big sword into the Horadric Cube. The Horadric Cube could freeze time, which allowed the big sword to maintain at a state before the massive explosion. At first, Abel was a little skeptic when it came to making this super exploding big sword. Despite his previous one being made with a 100 skills iron base, it already had an earth-shaking power of the explosion. This time, he would need to make one with a 120 skills iron base. If something had gone wrong, the entire Harry Castle would be blown into pieces. But Abel had no choice. He was on the road of no return. If things had gone wrong, at least he could end in mutual destruction with the enemy. In regards to Harry Castle, he no longer cared. Abel clenched his teeth. He began to draw a fire rune onto a big sword of 120 skills. At this point, it was easier for him to draw a perfect rune than intentionally drawing one incorrectly. Abel then took out a perfect red gem and stared at the gorgeous, brilliant red color of the gem. Who could have guessed? In a flash of a second, such beauty could turn into a nightmarish force of destruction. The super exploding big sword he made last time was an ice magic one. This time, it was a fire magic one, so Abel was fully aware of its power of destruction. If he could not control its power properly, the only purpose for this super exploding big sword was to give mutual destruction for him and his enemy. This thing was way too dangerous. It might even injure innocent people. Abel gave out a sigh and placed the perfect red gem into the gem hole. As he was guiding it with his power of will, a massive amount of fire magic power rushed towards his power of the will like an exploding volcano. If he was still an amateur, or if his power of the will had never developed, it might get completely blown away by this massive amount of fire magic power. Soon, the super exploding big sword began to shine in white light. It seemed like it was about to be completed, but Abel did not relax in the slightest bit. He unwaveringly locked his power of the will on to the super exploding big sword. The white light flashed for a few more times before it turned into red light. The red light intensified. It was so bright, Abel could no longer even open his eye to examine the condition of the super exploding big sword. Luckily, Abel still had a lot of power of the will left over. He continued to ruthlessly lock it on to the super exploding big sword. He felt that everyone was still under control. Alongside the blinking red light, the originally rigid body of the big sword of 120 skills began to vibrate. It seemed like it was trying to withstand this vicious force of fire magic. Although the 120 skills iron base had already exceeded the strength limit of iron, it was still normal iron. These types of materials were essentially not a match for this massive amount of fire magic. As the vibration intensified, Abel sensed the surface of the sword was beginning to crack through his power of the will. A quick jerk with his power of the will, the super exploding big sword had completely disappeared. Soon, it reappeared in the Horadric Cube. Abel let out a breath of relief. This thing was very different from normal exploding big swords. Although normal exploding big swords were very powerful, he still felt confident about escaping its explosion. But this thing, it was beyond Abel's imagination. During the making process, Abel had already sensed that this fire magic super exploding big sword was a lot more destructive than his previous ice magic one. Abel still did not know how perfect red gems like the one just used could even exist. If a wizard had seen how he had just treated one of them, the wizard would definitely choke Abel to death. These perfect rank gems, especially the ones combined with the Horadric Cube, was considered as the most powerful, pure, irreplaceable gem in this world. Therefore, one could say, the number of gems like this could be produced was hopelessly small. Clang, clang, clang. As the loud and rushed noise of the bell spread across every corner of the hairy castle, Abel began to lose focus on the base that he was forging. It was a 120 skill base that he was making, but would only take a second for him to accidentally snap it into two. Abel threw the broken sword away with his thong. He rushed out of the workshop and ran towards the plaza inside Harry Castle. Had it novel been at? What happened? Abel grabbed one of the guards and asked. Wirgins were discovered outside the fort. Sir Abel. The guard quickly gave a bow to Abel. Abel stopped the guard before he was about to leave. Come with me. I need you to help me put my armor up. Regardless of its type, wearing armor was a very effortful thing to do for knights. Abel didn't have his own underling knights. The 20 men Marshall sent him were more like bodyguards than underlings, so it got weird if Abel were to order them to do anything other than fighting. If Abel were to have his own underling knights, he would have a lot less things to concern himself with. Underling knights could do many things for him, such as helping out with chores, maintaining armors and weapons, taking care of horses, changing armor for his master, supplying extra weapons, and etc. Despite the amount of potential Abel had shown, not a lot of people knew that he was already an official knight. Honestly, he preferred not telling people. Most people who found out were pretty strong themselves, e.g. Dickens, and they knew how hard it was for Abel if they revealed his true powers. Abel was just a little over 170 centimeters in height. The blue armor he was wearing was a perfect fit for him. It was the right weight, too. It wasn't heavy enough to slow down his movements. Apart from his armor, Abel also had his ice magic sword on his back. In his right hand was a red-based shield with a unicorn crest on it. Lastly, he's held a 5-meter, 300-pound lance in his left hand. These were the equipment he was wielding when he was climbing the hairy castle wall. You've come, Abel, Lord Marshall greeted in his golden bull armor. For a man who had been waiting for a war-djinn invasion for days, he seemed very relaxed at the moment. Any changes on the battlefield, Uncle Marshall? Abel asked. As calm as Lord Marshall seemed, his eyes were clearly strained with bloodshot. Besides, the golden bull armor takes a lot of time to wear. Maybe Marshall just hadn't taken it off for the past few days. Those Wirgins are starting to gather up. Apparently, they want to assemble a unit powerful enough to play a game of cat and mouse with us. Marshall replied, then turned towards his men with loud laughter. So we are the mice, and these dogs want to be the cat. Fine then, I say. We'll just knock their fangs out when that happens. In contrast to the serious atmosphere back then, the soldiers suddenly began to laugh out loudly. Abel knew Lord Marshall was trying to cheer them up. If these guards were too anxious about the upcoming battle, they wouldn't even perform half as good as they normally would. Where are the knight's servants? Abel suddenly realized and asked, shouldn't these men be inside the fort at a time like this? Oh, they're inside a secret tunnel outside the fort, Lord Marshall replied. These Wirgins don't know what formations are, so when they all gather up, we'll teach them a lesson in military tactics. Lord Marshall seemed very confident about that. Out of the 5 high-ranked wolf riders that were already discovered, he was sure he could take 2 to 3 of them, with his 2 magic swords and the golden bull armor, of course. And, while not a lot of people knew how strong Abel was, Marshall could tell how strong he was by practicing with him very frequently. Not just that, Abel also crafted magic weapons for the 20 knight servants. He didn't forge the swords and round shields himself, per se, but the magic he enchanted on them was just as powerful as any other of his work. If Lord Marshal was to use an ordinary weapon, he couldn't even defeat any one of the knight servants with a magic weapon in hand. Any attacks would be futile against a shield that was strengthened with magic. After an attack was neutralized, the ice magic sword would slow its enemy down for an endless stream of consecutive attacks. There was nothing you could do once you've been caught by it. That being said, Lord Marshal wasn't planning to let these knight servants face the high-ranked wolf riders. He was very much in agreement with what Abel's saying. As strong as the magic on the round shields were, any powerful attack could easily destroy the material that they were built from. It took time to activate magic effects. When a weapon hit a shield, the shield had to be strong enough to take the hit before the magic runes started doing anything. Technically speaking, an 80-skill round shield was clearly flawed in their design. Still, a small unit of 20 knight servants could launch a very devastating sneak attack to those virgins, who were ignorant of the powers of magic weapons they had. The first strike will be the most deadly one. From Lord Marshal's point of view, instead of having the knight servants inside the castle for defense and no offense, he would much rather use this firepower for a surprise attack on the battlefront. About 100 meters outside Harry Castle, more and more wolf riders were starting to gather up. Eventually, they stopped appearing on the battlefield. 5 high-ranked wolf riders, 50 intermediate wolf riders, and 100 beginner wolf riders. They're going big, aren't they? Lord Marshal exclaimed. It was noon now. Instead of choosing nighttime, which would have given them a lot more advantages, these prideful virgins chose to attack Harry Castle in the middle of the day. Don't worry about them if there isn't a commander, Abel commented. After seeing those wolf riders himself, he started feeling a lot less anxious. These wolf riders from the wolf family were very easy to recognize. 5 of the high-ranked wolf riders were wearing steel armor plates, and 50 of the intermediate wolf riders were wearing leather armor plates. The 100 low-ranked wolf riders were not wearing any protection on them at all, which reflected how much shortage the Orc Empire was in for armors. In the human world, every official knight would be granted his own armor, weapons, and other gear accordingly. All of the wolf riders had long spears as their weapons. While the appearance of those spears was all the same, the low-ranked wolf riders had ones with less metal in them. The intermediate and high-ranked wolf riders had either more metal in the spears or pure metal in the spears. Would you dare to go out now, boy? Why don't we rush out and hunt them down? Lord Marshal called out. As he said this in his shiny golden bull armor, he was like a god of war in front of the soldiers standing on the wall. You bet, Abel replied excitedly. Send out the horses. Lord Marshal shouted to his men. Pretty soon, 2 war horses, wearing half-body armor plates, were sent out. These 2 Mars were just recently bought from the Duchy of Thunder. Because of how heavy the golden bull armor and Abel's 300-pound lance were, regular horses weren't strong enough to ride them around. With the help of the knight servants, the 2 got up on the horses fairly quickly. As Abel sat on his one, he rubbed its back with his hand for a bit. He hadn't ridden it much after it was bought, so the most he could do now was improvise as he goes. As the war horses trotted away from the castle, Abel intentionally rode his one behind Lord Marshal. He whispered the enchantments as softly as he could, and a peculiar aura began to surround himself and his horse. Apart from Abel, there wasn't anyone else who possessed the power of the will. If there was, that person would feel a very overwhelming and distant force coming towards him. Abel was already used to this. Every time he massaged Black Wind with his mount enhancement technique, he would feel the same suffocating force with his 6th sense. The more Abel used his mount enhancement technique on his horse, the more he began to gain an understanding of its spirit. From what he could see, this was a very innocent and pure horse, which was destined to be a war horse since it was born. For all the training it had received, its sole purpose was to serve the knight it was supposed to carry. From its simple perspective, it was nothing but a part of its rider. The more Abel read its mind, the more he felt moved by its unconditional trust towards mankind. How can a creature maintain such spirituality and humility? Without such qualities, no knights would be strong enough to survive on the battlefield. Abel was getting slower. Lord Marshall could feel it. He turned around to tell Abel to hurry up, but what he saw had him in total shock. Every time Abel's horse staggered for a bit, Abel moved in the same direction slightly with his body. It was like their bodies were synchronized. Forget about Lord Marshall. Such horsemanship would not be expected from someone who was born on a horse. Again, Abel has proved himself to be in a completely different league from the rest of mankind. "I'm ready, Uncle Marshall." Abel smiled as he finished performing his mount-enhancing technique. Abel felt really good right now. He had never been so intimate with his war horse before, and nothing could calm him and his partner down except for a good, long race. "Open the gate." As Lord called for the gate to be opened, several guards came and lowered the castle gate. They quickly shut it back after Abel and Marshall went through. As the two went out of Harry Castle, the low-ranked wolf riders started howling towards them. They wanted to spring at the two humans right away, but their commanders stood stationary at their posts. "Don't start the attack," their instincts told them. As Marshall and Abel's horses started trotting instead of galloping, Abel could feel himself very excited for the upcoming battle. Again, it wasn't just him. His horse was ready for action, too. He could feel every inch of its muscles bulging at the sight of the wolf riders in front of them. As Abel's horse began to accelerate, it quickly went ahead of Lord Marshall and charged straight towards the wolf riders. Yes, it went solo into the enemy troops, and everyone was watching Abel from inside the Harry Castle. They did not know what their young master was planning, but they certainly felt admiration for his brave decision. "Combat Chi!" Lord Marshall screamed at the top of his lungs, and white combat Chi started flashing out his body. Actually, because he was wearing the golden bull armor, it looked more golden than white, which was the color it was supposed to be. Abel, too, screamed as he released his combat Chi. Unlike the one his uncle pretended to have, his combat Chi actually had the color gold to it. No one could tell, though. He was wearing a blue set of armor, so blue was the color that was reflected. Besides, since the sun above them was so bright, Lord Marshall looked more like the real deal than him. The knights charging on a horse technique. Almost simultaneously, Marshall and Abel screamed out the name of the Harry family's secret technique. Suddenly, the speed of their horses was doubled as they charged faster towards the enemy troops. Both of them had dropped their helmets by this point. As the sun shone upon them, two streaks of light, one blue and one gold, flew straight towards the same direction. The wolf riders saw this and all howled at once. It was a matchup of 2 against 150, and neither side was backing down. As disadvantaged as the knights appeared to be, they were becoming faster and more ready at every instance. Out of the 150 wolf riders that were charging towards Abel and Marshall, a high-ranked wolf rider was taking the lead. While the rest of them were yet to make contact, he was already facing Abel by himself. He didn't think much of Abel, whose build was much smaller than his. For orcs like him, brute force was all that mattered in a fight. Just when the two were about to clash their weapons against each other, Abel swung his lance and let the wolf rider take the first strike. He wasn't going for a block. Instead, he was going to dodge the hit because he knew it wasn't going to hit him. Abel was right. He was too fast for his opponent. Within a blink of an eye, his lance was already through the wolf rider's chest. It was like a hot knife cutting butter. The wolf rider wanted to resist, but he clearly had no way to make a defense. Abel's lance was not a regular wooden one. A wooden lance was meant for pushing back the enemy. It was a one-time weapon, something that would be destroyed right after it had done what it was designed to do. The one Abel was wielding was a steel one. Its base was hammered for 120 times before it was set into shape. It was a very heavy piece, but unlike most people, his muscles were sturdy enough to wave it around. The wolf rider was stabbed in his heart. As strong as the Wirgins were, a stab to the heart was more than enough to kill them instantly. Abel didn't stop, though. As the wolf rider's corpse hung on his lance, he continued to speed up his horse towards his enemies. A few arrows were shot at Abel, but with the armor that he was wearing, all of them, Abel didn't even pay any attention to them. He was more focused on his second target, which was an intermediate wolf rider that was coming at him. Unlike its dead superior, the intermediate wolf rider decided to parry away Abel's lance with its spear. It was a bad choice. Excluding the weight of the dead wargen, there was about 300 pounds of weight in Abel's lance. A quick fling with it was quite enough to break the wargen's spear into two. The rest was pretty obvious. As Abel had his power of the will fully turned on, he could clearly feel the wolf rider's bones tearing up and smashed into dust. Even its organs were starting to turn into mush. Pretty soon, its dead body, too, was skewered along with a high-ranked wolf rider. Had it novel been at? Despite having two dead wargens on his lance, Abel was not slowing down at all. Because of how fast he was going, both he and his horse were drenched with the blood of the dead wargens. Another one, fourth one, fifth one. Abel was finally stopped after he charged towards the fifth wolf rider. If it wasn't for the Harry family's secret knight's technique, he would have had to stop at 2 or 3. Lord Marshall stopped his horse as he had finally reached Abel. Whilst chasing behind Abel, he's also killed a few wolf riders on his way. Now that's more like it. Lord Marshall screamed frantically. For him, it felt like he was going back to the battle against the orcs. He was much younger at the time, much more impulsive and vigorous, too. Lord Marshall watched as Abel flung out the 5 dead wargens out of his lance. It was a frightening thing to look at on the battlefield. Fortunately for him, they were fighting on the same side. To battle, Lord Marshall called, and 20 of the bodyguard knights appeared from the underground tunnel. While they were all trained in horse riding, they decided to fight on foot because they were more used to that. Even now, the advantage was on the side of the wargens. As efficient as Abel and Marshall were in their attacks, they still had a much greater number than their human foes. That being said, because Abel managed to kill a high-ranking wolf rider by himself, everyone watching from Harry Castle were assured of their victory. The crowds were starting to quiet down as they looked at what's happening on the battlefield. Up next, it was the most gruesome and crucial of all, close-range melee combat to the death. All the wolf riders had their eyes on Abel, the short, underage knight who was wielding a ridiculously large lance with him. They could tell that he was a novice knight, but something about him didn't add up. Sure, Abel was a novice knight, but what kind of novice knight could kill 5 wolf riders in an instant? 1 high-ranked wolf rider, 1 intermediate wolf rider, 3 novice wolf riders. That's 5 in less than a second, and a child did it. The horse that Abel was riding on was becoming much more agitated than before. It seemed kind of relaxed back then, but the testosterone was starting to kick in. "My honor is my life," Abel screamed, and his horse sped up into the wolf rider's troop. The large, heavy lance in his hand was like a demon's hand, flicking away everything that it had scraped. Because of Abel's terrible strength and the effect of the lance itself, tens of wolf riders were sent flying away from their position. 20 of the bodyguard knights started lining up their formation. Once they were ready, they slowly trekked towards the remaining wolf riders. After witnessing Abel's bold display, the Knight of Marshall, too, chanted out the battle cry, "My honor is my life," and charged towards his enemies. If it was about engaging in direct conflict, the Knight of Marshall was much more experienced than Abel. The way he killed his enemies might not be as flashy, but the golden bull armor he was wearing was quite invincible against almost any attack. Under the command of their superiors, the novice wolf riders howled and charged towards Abel. They couldn't match him with their skills, but they could sacrifice their bodies to slow down his movements. And that's what they did. As several of the low-ranked wolf riders clung themselves onto Abel's lance, they have effectively sacrificed their lives to slow down his movements. If Abel wanted to, he could throw them all away in just one swing, but he clearly had no time to do that. With the little time that the wolf riders had stopped him for, a high-ranked wolf rider struck towards his chest with its long spear. Clang! But the armor was simply too durable to be penetrated. It was a devastating discovery for the wolf riders, as it had cost them so many casualties just to have the opportunity for an attack. Sadly for them, it was all the chance that they were getting. With one sweep of his 5-meter lance, Abel killed all the wolf rider that were within his reach. The wolf riders that were fighting Marshall also had the same problem. With all the resources on their side, they still couldn't manage to do any damage to him. It was a frustrating situation for them, and a miserable one at that. By now, all 20 of the bodyguard knights have already entered into the battlefield. As veterans who have come back from the war against the orcs, they were all fierce warriors who had a record to prove their worth. After struggling for a while, the Wolf Riders decided to draw their forces away from Lord Marshal and Abel. With a fraction of their troops keeping these two busy, the rest of them were aimed to destroy the small unit of the bodyguard knights. As the 20 humans were obviously in the warrior class, the Wolf Riders did not think that they would be wearing any powerful gears that could withstand their attacks. Even the orcs knew how valuable a magic weapon would be. There was just no way that it would be equipped by regular bodyguards. With my long sword in hand, my eyes toward the front, I am forged into steel. With my shield closes towards me, it guards my beating heart. As long as the unicorn is on my chest, I shall not waver. My banner shall remain. With the sound of horns echoed across the field, and my blade flashing with blood, the path before me shall be opened and clear. As the bodyguard knights began to sing their war song, the Wolf Riders struck their spears into their enemies' small shields. There were a lot of screaming and sounds of metal clashing against each other, but the formation of the bodyguard knights did not change at all. With the spears completely deflected, the bodyguard knights continued to sing their songs with a volume that could be heard from a mile away. These men were very organized in their teamwork. With 10 of them in the front row, making space for the 10 in the back, the 10 in the back struck with their long swords towards the enemies at the front. 2 of the Wolf Riders that were too slow to react to this. As their bodies were stabbed by the blades, a thin layer of ice came out and slowed down their movements. Things were as bad as it could get for them, as even these warriors were equipped with ice magic weapons. With just 2 seconds left, the 10 bodyguard knights who charged forward did not continue with their attacks, but instead guarded themselves with their defensive position. The other 10, on the other hand, stopped defending themselves and began launching their attacks with their combat chi. Within a blink of an eye, 2 of the Wolf Riders were shot in the head and died immediately. After the bodyguard knights finished their attack, they returned to their defending position and started recharging their combat chi, and the other 10 began to launch their own attack. Wave after wave, they pressed onto their enemies like an unending flood. If it weren't for the magic equipment they were wearing, such formation would be very risky against the powerful Wolf Riders. Like knights, warriors were a very legitimate class to be in. That being said, however, they did not engage in the same kind of systematic training as the knights when it comes to practicing their combat chi. While knights fed themselves with large amounts of food since when they were young, warriors had to rely on regular food to maintain their bodies. The resulting combat chi would be very different for the two classes. While warriors were very explosive in their release, they could not maintain their chi for too much time and often had to wait for their internal energy to be recharged. Knights, on the other hand, were much more durable because of the stamina they had trained for. In terms of explosiveness, the knights were also better than the warriors on average. Technically speaking, the warriors were inferior to the knights, but they were often the unit that was the most commonly used on the battlefield. Knights were much harder to train. So many of the military tactics present were designed for the warriors. The tide formation was a classic example. Whilst using this formation, the warriors were required to put their utmost trust in their comrades. When attacking, they ought to use up all their energies without reserve. When defending, they must do all they could to block any attack for their partners. If the high-ranked Wolf Riders were trying to attack the bodyguard knights, Abel and Marshall would keep them in check by chasing them down. Pretty soon, each one of them was able to trap 2 of the high-ranked Wolf Riders from assisting their comrades. To be honest, Abel was not happy to be in this situation. The Mount Wolves were simply too agile for him to make any killing blow. No wonder they were so suitable in guerrilla warfare. I hope you grow up soon, Black Wind, Abel prayed in his mind. If he was riding on a fully grown Mount Wolf right now, these Wolf Riders wouldn't have been fighting him so easily as they were. After blocking a sword with his shield, Abel used his lance to pick up a Wolf Rider's spear from the ground. He then released his gold combat chi and transferred about 7,000 pounds of force from his lance into the spear. When the knight's lance was fully charged, He threw the spear with the firepower of a small missile. Had it novel been at, and a missile it truly was. Whilst flying through the air, the spear went through 2 of the wolf riders and disappeared into the horizon. As effective as this method was, Abel decided to try it again. Pretty soon, another wolf rider over the distance had a hole punched through its neck. The 2 high-ranked wolf riders facing against Abel looked at each other for a bit. Suddenly, they howled towards the sky and called for their underlings. Instead of attacking Abel himself, all the forces were now diverted into the horse he was riding on. Such a way of attacking was quite rare to see. Whether it was the humans or the orcs, mounts were a very cherished resource even on the battlefield. If a wolf rider's mount wolf did not launch an attack, most human knights wouldn't bother to attack it directly. Mounts were not to be attacked. This was an unspoken rule that was established many centuries ago. Abel knew about it, which made him even angrier about what these wolf riders were doing. Abel turned his head and looked for the bodyguard knights. After checking for the distance between him and them, he swung his lance around and forced the wolf riders to back away from him. As no one dared to make a move on him, he took the time to jump down from his war horse and patted it on the back. Abel was telling his horse to leave. The horse understood this, then neighed as it ran outside the battlefield. Obviously, the wolf riders were free to do whatever they wanted with it, but they didn't bother to attack a vacant war horse with nobody riding on top of it. Abel had a grim look on his face as he resumed his fight these wolf riders. After blocking several spears that were struck at him, he threw away his shield and picked up one of them from the ground. One of the spears managed to land a hit on him, but he didn't really care about it. With a swing of his arm, he shot one of the wolf riders down in its eyes. After that, he picked another lance and repeated the same process. That's right, Abel didn't care to defend himself. The armor he was wearing has made him completely immune to these wolf riders. Another lance was thrown, and with that, another wolf rider was taken down. Since there wasn't any weapon that he could find near him, Abel picked up some rocks and threw it towards his enemies. With arms as strong as his, the power that was released was the same as that of a mini catapult. He was very accurate, too. Every piece that he threw managed to take down another wolf rider to the ground.